Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to a stream that may not turn out to be quite what we plan. It may require me to change the thumbnail and the entire video description later, but I'm hoping that at any moment, Sotek will arrive. He is not here yet. I have pinged him, I have sent messages, but this could be my fault, not his. That may leave you wondering, how could this possibly be the case? After all, he's the one who's not here. And the answer to that is that yesterday, I was extraordinarily ill. This happens every once in a while with me. I am just out of it. And I was incapable of doing anything. And I sent him a quick ping saying, I might not be able to make tomorrow. I will do everything in my power to make sure I'm there. Because after all, it's my birthday this week. In fact, it was a couple of days ago, but that doesn't matter. We've not had an actual birthday Lorebeards stream. We had the Wednesday stream, but that was before my birthday. My birthday has passed now. I am actually a year older, and I'm feeling it. Apparently yesterday in particular. And he sent me a message about an hour ago saying, are you up for it? And I sent a message just 20 minutes ago saying, yes, definitely, because I just woken up. So, I'm not entirely sure if Sotek is going to arrive for this one, or whether he'll catch my message saying, yeah, I'm definitely here, I'm definitely going to be doing it in time. He might have organised something completely different for this afternoon, perhaps a lovely jaunt over in Nagashazar to see the exact details of what ghouls are. So, I'm going to give him a little bit of time to turn up, because that would be nice, and let's see if he actually arrives. If he doesn't, then we will just carry on with some sort of Ask Me Anything, because I would not like to tackle ghouls without him, because this is a subject that I know he has got a couple of pretty strong opinions on. And it's much like myself, I have some pretty strong opinions on this one too. This is a subject, ghouls in particular, that, well, the lore isn't exactly deep, and indeed it's copy-pasted throughout the editions, and you'd think that because of that there'd be little in there that was of consequence, but you'd be wrong. This is a little bit like the Dragon Ogre stream that we did an absolute age ago, in that the implications for what's written into the lore are much bigger, at least I think they're much bigger, than you might first realise. So I'm super excited to talk about it, assuming that Sotek arrives. However, I have no Sotek right now, so as we sit here with our thumbs a-twiddling, why don't we do a quick Ask Me Anything? So if there's anything at all Warhammer related, because it's Lorebeards, this is not just an Ask Andy anything type thing, because it's Lorebeards, do feel free to drop a question in. I will quickly endeavour to answer anything that gets dropped in. So if there's any burning little question on the side that you would like to ask, then drop it into the comments and I will quickly pick it up. I'm also got here with my good old Mass Effect glass, because it's my birthday. And I'm not saying that there's anything alcoholic in here, but it's my birthday. Love it. So let's start off with Jason White. Because it's a controversial one. Why do I dislike Gelt? Or is it just a meme at this point? It is a bit. And I do dislike Gelt. But I dislike Gelt for reasons that most people wouldn't expect. We have long said that we will discuss Gelt in depth when we reach 10k subscribers over on YouTube for LAWhammer. We're currently at about 7.5k subscribers, something like that. So that's on the channel right now if you happen to be watching on YouTube. And I'll go into in-depth into it. The in-world reasons are significant, but the out-of-world reasons, as in the way that Gelt was used, are also significant. It's a character that I really rather dislike. I don't have the same passion for my dislike that perhaps Sotek once had for Kremlo. I say once because he's slowly softening his opinion. It's gone from I hate it 100 but yeah, I do dislike that character. So something there that yeah. Let's see what this one is. I'm literally just pinging up anything that pops up. Obviously, if anyone pops super chats, I'll pop them up first. Do we know names of other magic languages than those used by humans? Yeah, there's really only two of them detailed with any depth, and although arguably three, arguably more. Actually, there's several as I think on it. First, we have the very obvious lingua praestantia. The lingua praestantia is the language of magic as expressed by the colleges of magic in the Empire. And it is a simplified version of what the elves use, because humans can't speak language in the same way that elves can. It's not just that. Elves went, oh, humans, oh, let's simplify it down just to keep it simple. It's more than that. Elven tones and elven speech can't be fully replicated by human vocal cords because they have, well, they're different species. They enunciate things completely differently. That being the case, they can't quite grasp the full implications of ancient elven versions of language of magic without being, well, mutants or somehow otherwise deeply trained in how to basically reproduce these sounds that their vocal cords are not by their nature designed to replicate. The ancient elven language by comparison is Anaquaean, which is as close as you're going to get to the foundational language of everything that you can without actually speaking demonic, which is the third of our close ones. Demonic is the language of concept. It is the language of the aether being made manifest into the material. Demons speak a language at their heart, which is capable of reshaping matter around it. And they often speak in their ancient demonic version of the language, demonic things as they arrive, which causes magic and the like to happen around them. And that's often forgotten. Dark Tongue, the language of beast men, various chaos cults, and a whole variety of other naughty things, is based on demonic. Anaquaean is also based on demonic, but they generally wouldn't refer to it as demonic. They'd refer to it as the language of the spirits or something equivalent, or the language of the gods, because equally it's the language of the gods. So we've got lots of different versions that are definitely in the lore, but there's more than that as well, because there's a host of spellcasters and magic users that use a variety of the words. Let's just call it language of magic, which is a bastardized version of their own language mixed up with sounds and tones that cause the winds of magic to reverberate and react. These are impure versions, if you wish, of things like the lingua praestantia. And many of these languages are pretty well codified. Humanity has been studying magic for literally thousands of years in a variety of different shapes and forms across the world. And each one of those different traditions have come up with their own languages. None of them are quite as pure as Anaquaean. None of them are as direct and as simple as, say, for example, lingua praestantia. But lingua praestantia is missing huge chunks of expressions and words and modifiers that could be used to manipulate magic, things that some of the older traditions have hard coded into them because of their tried and tested versions of using them. A way of examining that, if you wish to get a quick balancing view to that, to try and imagine it, consider medicine. Modern medicine binds together loads of a variety of different chemicals, plants, et al. Into pills. This is, in many respects, the ancient Anaquaean version, as in they've got lots of medicine that really works and they know how it works because it's well tested. They've been using it for ages. But you've also got old ancient faiths who believe that they can heal using a variety of other things. And some of those faith healings, which may come from plants, which may come from a whole host of other areas, are sometimes effective. And that's somewhat similar to the various traditions of magic that you get across the world. So yeah, there's loads of them. Literally loads of them, ranging from demonic to ancient, elven, and there's one more other one which is worth calling out, and that's arcane dwarf. Arcane dwarf does manipulate the winds of magic and is popped up in a very few sources, but is there, so definitely worth considering. Arcane dwarf is unexpectedly a language that directly can shape the winds of magic around it, but dwarves themselves can't shape with the words. So the words cause things to happen, but they don't create spells or any equivalent around it, but they can be used using this arcane dwarf to shape runes and channel the magic into the runes. It's an ill-conceived part of the background because it's an old Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay first edition set of terminology being occasionally applied to far later edition version of what the dwarves are. But Arcane Dwarf originally could also use and manipulate the winds of magic. Right, for those of you who don't know, I'm currently without Sotek. Hoping that he will arrive. We would like to be discussing ghouls. Until he does arrive, assuming that he will arrive, we're just having a quick Ask Me Anything, much like we did, was it really last Sunday? It really was, wasn't it? So we're waiting for Sotek if he arrives. If he doesn't arrive, we'll just keep on doing Ask Me Anything until he does. I would like to discuss ghouls, though, because ghouls are freaking amazeballs, as I discussed earlier in the stream. Hey, Jack Flanagan, and thank you very much for the super chat. Good day, Addy. A good day to you in return. If vampires are all material entities without souls in the ether, what would happen if vampire enters the realm of chaos? It would bring its own material perceptions and awareness into the aether, meaning that the aether itself would begin to shape and become more fixed in tone and nature. But this is the case for pretty much anything that moves from the immaterial realm from the material realm into the immaterial. It's one of the reasons why whenever you get stories of entering the realms of the chaos or seeing the realms of gods or whatever, they're quite imaginable, because they have got their own limited perceptions, and those perceptions perceive what they perceive. So you get, for example, what we described when we were going through all of our Lorebeards episodes with Castle Brass. All the coronate nonsense, the fields of blood that work with Khorne. And you will get that because of their ability to perceive and shape what is already perceptually possibly there because of the way that the conceptual nature of the realm of the gods works. So broadly speaking, they would see the realms of chaos as they're often described, and they would become, if anything, more real because of that, and the gods would want to get rid of them because that would be a curtailment upon what the aether actually is. In the same way that when chaos arrives in the real world and it causes the world to mutate and change and become a hellscape, when the material folks come into the realm of chaos, they make it much more solidified, certain, and calculable in a way that the spirits and demons et al. On that side generally don't like. Basically, they're almost antithetical to each other in almost opposite ways. That's one way to read it, but you'll find the authors will reimagine this according to their own version of how they think the cosmology of Warhammer works, particularly the realm of chaos, according to the needs of whatever story they have. So don't take that as a certain, this is the answer. Take it more as that's the most common answer, but you will find that others will do other things with it. In the same way that something without a corpus, as in no material body, can definitely do things in the material realm. I'll give you a couple of examples. Spirits, ghosts, demons don't physically properly have a corpus, but can manipulate the material realm. The same is the case for things without a soul, without arguably a reflection in the aether. These entities are entirely material, but they can still influence the immaterial realm. Hopefully that answers. The Laughing God, Andy, there are 3 areas about the setting that you... Pardon me, I missed the big what there. Rather important. What are the 3 areas about the setting that you would like to change or flesh out if you were granted the ability to write it without any pushback? Oh, God. Right, so there's a couple of things here. Number 1, we're still waiting on Sotek in the hope that he will arrive so that we can discuss our ghoul stream. He has not arrived, but we're just carrying on with a couple of Ask Me Anythings as we go. Number 2, this is a toughie. When I was producer for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, I was in this rather unique position where anything that I wrote largely would get no pushback, and I could flesh out in any way I wanted. Now that might surprise you because you'd go, but surely Games Workshop would stop me. And I think that sort of misunderstands the relationship that someone like myself would have with Games Workshop. They don't. And the reason they don't is because what I write is Warhammer. I don't write things that go against Warhammer lore. I don't write things that are crazy. My streams, LAWhammer, the roleplay game that we do every week, is proper over-the-top bullshit with lots of crazy stuff in it. But that's not the kind of thing that I would generally write if I was writing the official game. If I was writing for the official game, I'd be looking for things that require expanding because it's never happened yet. And I'll give you a clean example of this. Myrmidia was just an Athena copy-paste job originally back in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. Not Athena, pardon me, Myrmidia was originally an Athena copy-paste job. I think that's what I said. In her first iteration back in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 1. And she had been a goddess of strategy throughout and had had no development at all. Where other gods in the setting had had a significant amount of development. So when I was brought on to develop Myrmidia further, we did. And I did, significantly. We took the goddess as she was then, and we went, hey, no, this is a goddess who has walked the earth unlike others, is the most important goddess in the old world for a variety of different reasons, is the core goddess of Astalia and Tilia, which at that point was already established fact because of books like Dogs of War, which had in 5th edition made it very clear how important Myrmidia was, but they hadn't explained why. Other than war, yeah, strategy. And that got massively expanded outwards in the Tome of Salvation. And that was me. I'd recommend go check in the Tome of Salvation. I didn't have much space to do it. I only had about 4,000 words, but I did 2 things in particular to significantly add to the background. Number 1 was the Myrmidian section itself, where it describes the cult. And the next one was a monastery added called the Monastery of the Dark Maiden, which added all manner of potential secrets and mysteries to that cult. And there was no real pushback to any of that. The only pushback that I got was, if anything, to add more, because I got a quick call, I remember, from the developer of that book, and she very much said, could we not have some more of this and maybe this as well added to it, because we would like to expand it further, because Games Workshop often uses the roleplay games to expand outwards with the lore that the studio can then look at and pick and choose from the bits that they like to then reinterpret and bring to the battle game. So all of that is to say, I've had this opportunity already. And I really like doing all of it. But if I was to grab a few things, number 1 would be the Everqueen and exactly how it works, because it is appallingly written. So that's number 1. Definitely the Everqueen. That needs written. Number 2 would be Albion, because number 2 would be Astalia, because Astalia is a wasteland of background. There's literally nothing there, and it's a core component of the old world, as important as Bretonia, as important as the Empire, as important as Kislev or Norska or any of those other areas. Astalia needs background. Albion needs background too, but Astalia has been harshly treated. So I'd like to see Astalia given a proper full treatment. I wouldn't mind running that. I'd get myself some folks in who truly understood the real world areas there, but I'd also be looking for people who were subject experts on not just that, but also real world Middle Eastern countries, because there's been so much influence in Astalia on that, and I'd be looking to incorporate components of that and warhammering it all up. So let's go for 3 things, because that's only 2 so far, although Albion's really close. It's a toughie. What would be the 3rd one? Is there a god that I'd really like to see? Yeah, I'd like to tackle Malal. I think Malal can be easily woven into the background of the existing setting without needing to be this crazy weird thing that many people generally pitch it as. I already squeezed Sulcan back into the background, and then Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4 later ran with that even further. So I'm super pleased to see that that's come back. But I think, although it was given short shrift, but I would definitely like to tackle that. Is there a species that's missing? Because I got gnomes back into the game. I did a really big treatment on that. And they got used in Blood Bowl afterwards. So, yeah. It's a toughie. I would probably change my mind on this every time you ask me, is what I'm probably going to conclude with this one. Sir Panza, before I say you're one, Sir Panza, and thank you very much for the super chat. We're waiting on Sotek in the hope that he does arrive. We are, however, 22 minutes in. We may have to abandon this session and just simply say Sotek won't be arriving. It's just an Ask Me Anything, but he may arrive yet. And if he does, we will pick up on ghouls. But as we're awaiting, happy birthday. Thank you very much. It was a very good birthday. I've got my Mass Effect glasses here. I've got a nice print that our producer for the LAWhammering streams sent me, which is lovely. Sent me. She gave it to me literally last Friday when we were over here doing roleplay. And you can just see that sitting there. If you didn't know, our producer for LAWhammering is a Warhammer artist. I hired her to help with Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4th edition, and she has been working for not just that, but other Warhammer projects as well. She's the best, but her actual personal art style is extremely graphic, quite anime influenced and manga influenced, and I love it. So anyway, getting to the important stuff here. It was a good birthday. Happy birthday to our very first being to crawl from the primordial soup at the dawn of the world. I am that old. You are correct. May your awakening herald the end times. Hey, Sir Pans, I'm sure there are a few that would disagree. Villain painting, as we said, we're waiting for Sotek. Just in case you're tuning in right now, wondering where he is, I don't know. I'm hoping he'll turn up, but if he doesn't, we're just going to continue on with Ask Me Anything until he does. Finally bought a copy of Dark Deeds. Yes, on that. I am happy to instigate the old thing that I did. Whenever someone buys a copy of Dark Deeds or claims that, I'm going to have a quick drink because it's my freaking birthday. So thank you for that, villain painting. Absolutely pleased to hear that. I hope your gaming is fun. I was playing that game just the other day. I lost terribly. It was hilarious because everyone ganged up on me. They sucked. Got a nice satisfying pop there from my bourbon I'm drinking. Wait, I'm not sure what bourbon I'm on this time. I'm on Single Barrel Select Jack Daniels, which, of course, I bastardized with Pepsi Max because I am me. Cheers for that, villain painting. Appreciated. Really appreciated. You will be just waiting for it to arrive, and we'll be sharing it with work colleagues over lunch when it arrives. Brilliant. Charles CK, thank you very much. Appreciated. Why do greenskins wear pants but beastmen don't? So I've asked this. I asked this, and it was tongue-in-cheek. It was a long time ago. I was down in the studio, and I pitched it as a question. There was an ask the various folks anything. At that point, I was working for retail, and they had dragged out some folks from the studio, poor bastards, to answer questions from the various idiots that had been working in the various shops. I asked this not as a question, but as a question solution, which was, does that actually so that the greenskins in this instance are spore-based in the Warhammer world, much as they are in 40k, because they are following the trappings of their genetic codings, where the beastmen are far more just doing what they want to do because they're fucking beastmen, or something along those lines. And they looked at each other and went, you know, that's a pretty good answer. And that was their answer. Their answer was, that's better than the answer we were going to come up with, which is because that works for the models and we don't want to sculpt orc cocks all over the place because they don't have fur, which is the real reason. The real reason is because beastmen are covered in fur, and thus you can hide all the potential genitalia that may be on display. Not to say that there isn't a bunch of very old metal models which had genitalia on display in a variety of different ways, many of which weren't released, particularly Chaos models. I got a bunch of those when I was working on a in-staff diorama once, which included beastmen with large penis horns and the like proper daft and old. Those were never released. But in this particular case, the answer is obviously for sculpting reasons, but you can make some pretty damn good in-world reason answers if you wish to do so. The Singemeister, DMing currently, so can't watch. Oh, but Shorin lives, and hopefully Sotek lives as well. I'm feeling a little bit concerned that he's not spotted anything, but I'm going to presume, much as I discussed earlier in the stream, that because I sent him a message yesterday saying that I might not be able to turn up because I was feeling so bad. Yesterday, I was ill. Today, I am pretending I'm not ill, so everything's fine. And I didn't ping him today until around about half an hour before the stream went live because I was asleep. I'm presuming that he just thinks that we're not on this week and he'll catch a message at some point and go, Oh no, Andy's there! And if that happens and Sotek arrives, we'll be diving straight into ghouls, because I very much want to discuss that particular subject. But if that doesn't happen, well, it doesn't happen. Spitfire 703, if Malekith were to die, that's a big one. Imagine Malekith dying. That's one of those big what ifs. Just before I read the rest of your question, I've had down through the years many discussions about Warhammer's lore with a variety of different characters who've helped create it. One of the favourite little side questions I often came up with is, what's your favourite what if that would make a significant impact to the entirety of the Warhammer world? And the what ifs surrounding the elves are often much more impactful than almost anything else. It's astonishing just how much the elves have shaped the world. Anyway, if Malekith were to die, who'd be next in line to rule the Dark Elves? Who took over when Malekith was in the realms of chaos? So we don't really have proper answers for all of this, and Marathi is an obvious first nod for some because she is the oldest and arguably one of the most powerful. And the reason that she doesn't scrabble for power is because of her son. And she's quite happy doing her own thing. And whomever was responsible for killing her son would receive the wrath of her. And it would be terrible to behold. And would she try and shape all Dark Elves towards that purpose? I think she probably would. Now, would they all follow her? Most wouldn't, because they're Dark Elves. The Witch King has an extraordinary control over the Dark Elves because it was there at the beginning and has been built upon from that point onwards, meaning that anyone that comes in has that entire legacy to deal with to try and take over power. There is no proper process in place for who takes over next beyond being the most powerful, and every Dark Elf worth their salt thinks they might be that guy. That being the case, I think the answer would be probably civil war. And a bolstering of power, a build-up of different armies and different groups all claiming that they should be ruling. In this case, Malekith wasn't definitely dead, and I'm sure there was ways of using precognition and various different forms of magic to know he probably wasn't dead, meaning that everyone would have been terrified to try and take his place. So I reckon that during that interregnum period, there was no real interregnum. Malekith was still ruling, but just not there. He was ruling from wherever else, and the processes of his court were both stymied and turned into a political nightmare, but no one was willing to try and take the stab at the throne because it would be suicide. That said, though, if I was writing it, there definitely would have been multiple attempts on the throne. The lore that we have, I think, doesn't necessarily do the Dark Elves enough justice for the true spiteful natures that they have, and the horror of what they could present should their king be taken away. I think there should have been some pretty bitter infighting, and some of them there would have been a rise for one figure, and it probably wouldn't have been the figure you expect, who would eventually take control, and they would then wage a campaign against the other Dark Elves to bring them underneath their banner, and then move onwards with probably the Witch King returning at some point and ruining their day. Yeah, probably. Coup badge. Coup by. Coup. Oh, it could be pronounced more than one way. Apologies for pronouncing it incorrectly. Hi, Andy. Hello. And for those of you who are just tuning in, we're still waiting, hopefully, for Sotek to turn up. He has not done so. That being the case, I'm just streaming live until he does, or until we run out of questions. And I'm just answering questions as we go. If he does turn up, we'll be immediately diving into ghouls. Because, yes, it's my birthday stream, which was supposed to be last week. And, yes, it should be fun, but it may not occur. We'll see. And almost certainly my fault, because I didn't tell Sotek that I was definitely doing it this week, because I'm currently not very well until almost the last hour. So blame me, not Sotek. Anyway, hi Andy. I started getting into the old world with some Ironbreakers. Oh, nice. Do we know the Heraldry of Karat Vlag or any other hold? Love your work. Yeah, there's a ton of good heraldry pieces by Mark Gibbons, who did, I don't think he did Karat Vlag though. Mark Gibbons, let's see if I can get the link for you. Dwarf art. So what you need to do is go on to Google or some equivalent, do search for Mark Gibbons concept art, for dwarfs, and you'll get a whole bunch of really cool Mark Gibbons pieces. Now, I obviously love Mark Gibbons. If you don't know how much I love Mark Gibbons already, you clearly haven't been following me in any of our streams. Mark Gibbons is one of the artists from the 90s, primarily from Games Workshop. He moved into companies such as Sony and Blizzard and Riot Games and helped define many of their things. So things like World of Warcraft or, hey, Arcane very recently. Even that's got some stuff that Mark helped design. And his concept art is great, and he works with us over on Rookery Publications. In fact, for my birthday, I just received one of the very first Skaven pieces from the very first Skaven army list all the way back in the early 90s. And I've got the original pencil piece. I've got it through in my living room. The other one, it's going to be going up on my wall probably there so that you can all see it in the stream, because holy crap balls, how cool is that? That aside though, if you do a search for Mark Gibbons concept dwarf art, one of the many concepts that you'll find up there is his concepts for the dwarf runes of the for the holds, and he did very simple geometric designs which look a little bit like Celtic knotwork. I'm trying to see if I can find it. I can't find it live during the stream, slightly annoying. Perhaps someone else can find that as we're going, but he did that for most of the holds, but I don't think he did Carrot Flag, at least not off the top of my head. So I'll look into that. When I was doing our version of LAWhammer, for example, there's a hold in that Carrick Skug, or Carrick Skyga, as some prefer to pronounce it. Now, Carrick Skug didn't have a rune, so I made a rune for Carrick Skug. I recommend doing the same. They're super, super easy to make. In my case, I went for, it was the volcano, so it's a up, across, down, and then it goes across and then goes down into a lake underneath, which is a flattened part of the rune, and then laps over. So we get ourselves a nice little rune which shows the volcano in the lake that Carrick Skug was known for. Big glacial lake. But yeah, take a look at it. Most of the runes are a simplified version of what the hold is most known for. So I'd use that as the inspiration for creating your own if you wish to do so. And if you don't know out there, we're still waiting on Sotek in the hope that he will turn up so that we can discuss ghouls. If he doesn't, we're just going to continue on with an Ask Me Anything until either he arrives or he doesn't. And we're going through lots of different versions of Warhammer lore, Warhammer lore, depending upon what everybody asks. Hey, the bloat person, thank you very much, by the way. How would you handle Bretonnians having the most modern navy and best human seamen in Man of War? Right. I did take a drink over that one because that's a controversial subject. Man of War was a game of naval conflict that was released by Games Workshop in the early 90s. And Man of War codified a lot of what would be used by Games Workshop for its naval-leaning stuff forever. So whenever, for example, you find the army of the Empire, for example, going to sea and having its naval equivalent, they used the great ships, the wolf ships, the ships of the line that were presented in Man of War as the core components of what their fleet should look like. Bretonnia, however, during the time of Man of War, was very different to the later Arthurian example we would have, and their fleet fucking kit-assed. Exceedingly fast, an enormous amount of broadsides on either side, cannons everywhere, and literally everything about their fleet goes against the core canonical work that was later added to the Bretonnians as we look at the Bretonnian Army List presented in 5th edition, and then the Bretonnian Army List in 6th edition, and then the Bretonnian Army List. Oh, they barely got Army Lists after that. I think they got 7th, but they didn't get an 8th. No, I don't think they even got 7th. They were properly stiffed. Or maybe they did. I can't remember which one came out when. I'm going through the books that I've held in my hand. They didn't get an 8th. They didn't get a 7th, I think. And the Bretonnians are canon averse, but their fleet isn't, which leaves us with two choices if we're going to adapt the lore from Man of War. Number one, we adapt it as is, and we say that this is a part of the Bretonnians that lies outside of what the army list discusses, or alternatively, we dismiss it entirely and we instead present great big floating medieval weapon platforms that are covered with trebuchets and catapults instead, more Bretonnian style weapons, and they're effectively giant walking battlefields where Bretonnians can come up, sidle up to another ship and have a big massive war with their knights in their metal armor, definitely not sinking to the depths of the water and their deaths. The Bretonnians as they currently stand have a shit fleet if we go with anything close to the Arthurian legend. I like their Man of War fleet. And if I was writing it, I would embrace the complete nature of what it was and lean on the small amount of material that's been presented about the burgeoning and expanding Bretonnian middle class, particularly in the primary cities. And I would have them almost lying outside of standard Bretonnian law, doing a host of things they shouldn't be, but I would also support them with more ships that were far more facing towards what the knights would prefer. So we have ourselves perhaps our first core conflict in Bretonnia that stands out as different, and that's the very forward-leaning mercantile class who protect their trade routes with cannon against the lady and everything that the lady holds as honourable. And that would be, I think, a really controversial and interesting reading. I'd dial the fleet down to being very small, perhaps just a couple of merchant houses that are doing it, and just how much they are disliked by the core nobility of Bretonnia because of everything that they represent. But start showing that Bretonnia are not a bunch of backward idiots, that they are religious, and that religion leads them in a particular direction. But there are also, no matter what religion you're from, people who aren't necessarily going to follow through with what you think is important. And I like the idea of creating some form of conflict. So I would, broadly speaking, the bloke person, do both. I would both change it and add, not so much change, I'd add to it, and I'd also embrace it to start showing and building some conflicts inside the core of what makes for Bretonnia. Perhaps have them being, instead of focused on the lady, they could be focused on Shalia, or focused on Heindrich or Handrich, the god of merchants, perhaps focused on Manan, the god of the sea. There's lots of other ways we could do it, because even Bretonnia, for all that the books often forget it, is a polytheistic society. The lady is one god amongst many, much like Sigmar is one god amongst many in the Empire. And this would be a good way to explore how not everything is lady-centric in Bretonnia, but everything is influenced by the lady. In the same way that everything is definitely not Sigmar-centric in the Empire, but everything is kind of influenced by the Sigmar and modified by it. Say, for example, Talabicland, which for a long time outlawed Sigmarism, that still defining Sigmarism as a core part of their traits, and that's their exclusion of Sigmar to the outside of their borders for several centuries, well, like over 1,000 years. So yeah, I would be using this to try and create extra complexity and interest in the Bretonnian setting. At least that would be my first initial thought, but I might, through the building of it, whether that was with other people or whether it's just myself, find that there's a better answer as the words started hitting the screen. Alrighty, so for those of you who don't know, we're waiting on Loremaster of Sotek, although it's 40 minutes now, so I think this wait may turn into just me doing an Ask Me Anything. But if he does arrive, we will be doing ourselves a ghoul stream, although we won't have enough time really to cover it properly, so if he's not here soon, we will be just doing an Ask Andy Anything. And if that's the case, then that's the case. That's cool. We can do ghouls next week. We can make it our Christmas stream. That'll be super fun. Biofoot. Thank you very much, Biofoot. Appreciated. I just got my copy of Dark Deeds. Oh, if you've got copy of Dark Deeds, let me just take a drink. Right, got my copy of Dark Deeds. So kind of you to include a real fisherman in the package. Our battle was legendary, but now my tub drain is plugged up. I'm delighted that it arrived, Biofoot, and I hope you have as much fun playing it as we had putting it together. Mark and I were discussing that game for... it was actually months as we were putting together the second edition version of it. And I adore the game, so good luck with that. Let's just drop down to God sent me to make shit worse. Some people say that about me too. Can you explain Gur's connection to spirits? Yes, Gur's connection to spirits is the same as all of the Winds of Magic connection to spirits, and that is that spirits exist within the material realm because of the Winds of Magic. It's part and parcel of how they can exist. Gur is that wild wind, almost animistic wind, a wind that's tied directly through to creatures and animals and bestial traits expressing themselves in more... well, I don't want to say civilized species, because it's not just civilized species, but perhaps more Sentient? No, animals are still sentient in the Warhammer world in their own way, but certainly more higher intelligent style creatures. Ones that are generally not described as animals or monsters or whatever. So all of the various animal spirits are directly linked through to Gur. Gur is also a surprisingly cold wind, so anything that runs through, it's got a cold heart. The cold bestial heart that's only interested in feeding upon prey or whatever else it might be. But it's a far more developed wind than just that alone, because it also incorporates all the other animals that may not have predatory instincts. But when the wind goes wild, it turns all of the spirits and the spiritual animals, and often animals as well, into ravening beasts. Because it is, after all, the wind of beasts. So its connection to spirits is the same as all the winds of magic. Every single spirit or equivalent in the Warhammer world is both fueled by, exists because of, bathed within, or somehow is linked to one of the winds of magic. I hope that's enough there to give you an answer. We're now at Q2 and still no Sotek. I think we're going to have to say the Ghoul stream won't be happening today. I will change the thumbnail for this afterwards and just make it an Ask Me Anything number 15, I think. So we will almost certainly be doing that, but let's not worry about that. Let's find out our next question. Would you rewrite the Amazons if you could? Yes, and I'd do what I did with the gnomes. I wouldn't rewrite them per se. What I would do is I would take all of the existing lore, think about how we can make it properly match the version of Warhammer as presented in the 8th edition, or possibly the old world, because that's slowly taking prominence. Think about the core components of what that setting is attempting to say, and then bring it up to date and make it fit. The Amazons in Warhammer as a whole have no reason that they could not fit almost with a copy paste, but what also needs to be done is add a lot of extra lore to explain how they fit in properly, which is something that, for all I only had 5 pages I think to do that with the gnomes, I managed to do with gnomes. I think everyone seems to think that even if they hate gnomes, they think the treatment fits quite well with Warhammer, which I'll accept. Given that gnomes were such a controversial subject and no one wanted them in the first place, the fact that I got anybody to like them, as far as I'm concerned, was an absolute triumph. And the fact that we ended up with a gnome Blood Bowl team was astonishing. Particularly because the conversations around whether the gnomes were even going to happen, which, by the way, was Games Workshop's idea, not mine. Don't think this was me trying to impose an idea on Games Workshop. Games Workshop, when I communicated about the different options for how to handle gnomes, were the ones that said, let's just see if you can make the one that we like. And I did, and they passed it on the first go. And they were like, spot on, away you go, Andy. I just do exactly the same with the Amazons. I would update whilst simultaneously trying to keep everything that was already there still there for fans of the older material. Villain painting, or the One Len painting. Who is the best vampire Warhammer Fantasy, and why is it Harkon, Lord Hestia of Mortarks? Best vampire. So if you didn't watch our Wednesday stream, we had a really good discussion about the Mortarks of Nagash, which were the chief lieutenants of the God of Undeath in Warhammer. And it's fair to say that I might have laid into Harkon a bit for being a Mortark, even though, you know, he's awesome. And I have lots of preferences for vampires, to take this question relatively seriously. I like them all for different reasons. I think Neferata has been very badly handled by many. I think Vashanesh is an extraordinarily fascinating character, and you'll see why if you go back and take a look at our streams about Vlad von Karstein. I also really rather like... In fact, I like Abarash. I love him. Sure, and I love them all for different reasons. But a best vampire, how do we define best? Is in the one I like most? I'm going to do a small call out to Nathan Long, because he added tons of extra new detail in his Ulrika novels. And she's not the best vampire, but I was delighted to see them taking vampires in a different direction from what they had already done with the vampire army lists and what had been established before that by lore sources created by people like Kim Newman for things like Genevieve. Nathan took it in a new direction, which Games Workshop took. So I quite like that. So the fact that we got extra lore out of that gets a big, huge tick from me. Thanks, Nathan. Alrighty, so again, we were hoping that Sotek would turn up. He has not done so. So that being the case, let me just do a quick AMA with Andy Law. I'm just going to do the crappiest update. Save changes there. Your stream's scheduled. Oh, I can't change it because it's already scheduled. You stinking thing, because I'm using a piece of outside software. Let's see if I can change it on Twitch. Save changes. It'll let me save it on Twitch. So Twitch has got a different name stream at the moment, although I'll have to change YouTube afterwards. It looks like we definitely don't have him, so I'm going to send him a quick message saying we'll continue without, for the moment at least, but he might turn up anyway. Let me just send a quick message there. Okay, cool. That's Sotek updated as well in case he does arrive. And on that, we will continue on. This is now, at least for the moment, an Ask Andy Anything About Warhammer lore stream, which was not the plan. It's also kind of my birthday stream. We've not done a proper Lorebeards birthday stream yet, because this is my birthday week. I turned far too old just 2 days ago. Yeah. How do I pronounce Kegarach? I pronounce it like that, which I fully admit is going to be completely different to many others out there. So, Kegarach, for those of you that don't know, is a word that comes from, let's say, because we're in Warhammer Elven backgrounds. Because of that, I'm happy using a more Celtic way of pronouncing it, because many of the words, particularly for the Eldar, the Eldari, for the Elves, the Azure, particularly the Azrai, and the Aeonir, have strong Celtic roots, often drawing upon either Gaelic or Gaelic for their different word forms, and sometimes they're just direct lifts from Gaelic or Gaelic. That's two different languages, one from Ireland, one from Scotland. And if it's in those cases, the k noise that is very common in German is common in Scots, but is not common in English, is the version that I use. Now, that doesn't mean it is. Now, some will say Kegarach because they see a CH and they immediately go ch, like church, surely. And that's fine. There is no right way. I've spoken to writers who have written about the Kegarach and they have spelt it completely differently. Pronounced it completely differently to how I do. But you did ask how I pronounce it, and I pronounce it Kegarach. Which you know is a thing. Okay, Charles C.K., thank you very much for the super chat. Is the intent of the Dark Keys card cream of the crop that you roll to check to steal? Is this on that? So I'll pick this up over on the Rookery forum, over on Rookery Discord, because I noticed somebody posted about this some time ago and I didn't answer because it got posted when I was ill, and we deserve to go through those. That one there is the one card we want to redo. And if we ever move on to a new printing, we will probably do a different printing on the next printout, because the rule is not as clear as we would like. So I'll answer it over there to make sure that we've got it nice and clear, just to make sure that is the card that I'm thinking on. Let me just dive down. Let me give you a second while I just check that. I'm pretty sure it's that card. Rules questions. There it is. Let's dive back up to my last rule question. Hey, Andy. Pretty sure it's that one. I'll pick it up over on Discord though, because I don't want to get caught up too much here about Dark Deeds goodies. But if there's any rules questions, dive into the Rookery Discord and I'll answer everything over there. And any answers that I give will be coming from a mixture of myself, Mark Gibbons, or very occasionally we'll be pinging over to Andy. Although the second edition was very much just me and Mark resolving the rules. Raw Cyan, the Lion Bear. Thank you very much for the super chat. Andy, the centers of the New World still have no lore. Agreed. What would you do with them, considering that they are south of the Dark Elves? It should be neat. Yes, it should. So, I would want to go to town on these. Centaurs in particular in the Warhammer world are poorly explored. We have Centaurs, obviously, with the Beastmen. We have more than one reference to centaurs in Kislev at one point or another, possibly no longer. And the centers of Kislev and the Troll Country were said to have been the core foundation point for the Kislev Winged Lancers. Which is an interesting lore point. That pops up in a couple of sources like Riders of the Dead, I think, as I recall, which also speaks to lots of ancient civilizations there, which are just a lift from real world civilizations. But when we move over to the centers of the New World, we have a vast tract of area that's not explored. And we have ourselves, obviously, something that could drop into there, which is probably the Centaurs and something similar. And given that we have a complete lack of Native American civilizations, we would really want to be dialing in on that if I were making it, probably. I would be looking to get some folk in who could help me do that if I were doing it, or if I were in the studio, I'd be saying, hey, studio people, don't just do it yourself. Grab yourself a couple of folks from over there who are actually experts and can give you really cool ideas that you would never have considered of yourself, and then build on that. I would be looking to build into something like that, and I would be looking to answer one question in particular. How have they held off the Dark Elves? What have they done? How do they exist? What is it that makes them interesting and unique and cool? And what makes them something that ultimately, if you're messing around with Warhammer, something you'd want to collect and play with? What is it that's so amazing about them? And also, I would be very careful and somewhat leery of just taking someone else's culture and saying, oh yes, of course, they're horsemen, because that's a bit rubbish. It's an amalgamation of ancient Greek ideas with something that's very much not Greek. And whilst I like the core concepts of that and what they could represent, I would be looking for something much bigger, more fascinating and interesting than that alone. We've already had enough of taking a Native American potential civilization and just turning it into monsters with the lizard men, where they basically said, you know, all your peoples, there are monsters, which is not the most sensitive way of dealing with it. But nevertheless, they turned that into something that was worthwhile with time. Its first iteration was a bit of a joke and was called out by many as being really sort of racist, where later versions of it, they took it away from the joke and turned it into something that was a fundamental and core component of the Warhammer world, which I'll admit the first edition of it was as well. It's just it had so many more joke-facing aspects to it that just made it feel a little bit like, you know, taking someone else's culture and doing whatever the heck you want with it and making money out of it, which is literally the definition of cultural appropriation without any reference or connection to the original. But it was from its time, the 90s. You kind of let it off with it to a degree, but that doesn't mean that we should not move forward with a better eye. And I would really be looking to probably do something like that, but so much better. Walking Tree, thank you very much for the super chat. Hey Andy, hello. Could it be that benevolent demons angels are mainly not a thing because of thematic reasons rather than inward logic? Right, so first, you're wrong. There are benevolent entities. They're not called demons or angels. There are a host of manifestations of gods that are not the chaos gods that are benevolent. They pop up all over the place. They pop up in novels, they pop up in short stories, they pop up in the roleplay game, they pop up all over the place. And often they are mistaken for just simply spirits. And spirits are quite different. If we take a look at, say, for example, the Spites and the Tree Men and the various Dryads and Naiads and all the rest of it, they're fine examples of one type of spirit. But we've got lots of different spirits all over the Warhammer world. But we also have divine manifestations of the gods that are effectively the equivalent of demon/angels. So they are a thing. They exist. If you want to see some examples of that, you can find them in, say, the Tome of Salvation, a book for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 2nd edition, where things like the Blessed Servants of Mor, the great crows that arrive to bring souls over to the portal of Mor, they exist and they manifest within the real world. Massive white wolves of Ulrich. Now, that might not be to you an obvious sign of angel, a big slavering white wolf sitting approximately 7 foot at the shoulder, but from Ulrich's perspective, they are the warhounds of Ulrich, and they come into battle sometimes. Indeed, there are multiple examples of various blessed priests wearing their pelts, or indeed, in some circumstances, there's even some myths and legends of them being ridden into battle. So there are many examples of them for all the gods. They just don't take on the form that we we're used to in real world angels and demons, because it's a polytheistic world where they wouldn't have an equivalent of an angel or a demon. They would have their own divine manifestation, and that has been reflected in the lore in multiple places. So hopefully that helps a bit there. Hey Marathi, how's my bestie elf doing out there? Dark Deeds, woohoo! I'm quoting myself by, you also got it. Cheers, thank you very much. Happy birthday to us. I do like a nice wee drink. Oh, I love it. So I hope you enjoy the game anywhere near as much, as I said before, as us who made it. And for those of you who are arriving late, this was supposed to be a stream about ghouls, but unfortunately Sotek has not been able to make it, and it's my fault. So blame me, not Sotek, because Sotek thought I was ill. And I was. And I still sort of kind of am. But let's just pretend that's not happening. So instead, I turned up. He wasn't here, so we're just doing an Ask Me Anything stream. And we will almost certainly be doing ghouls the week after, unless by some miracle, Sotek just turns up and we have a good chat about it regardless. So thanks very much for that one, Marathi. Brock 6000. Let's just make sure I've not missed any twitchy comments there, because Twitch is very elusive sometimes. I don't think I have, but if I have, apologies. I don't think I have. Brock 6000. You have just bought your copy of Dark Deeds. Let me just take a drink. Also, question: do greenskins have their own, or can learn languages? Yes. Do they just believe that they're understood and therefore are? Thanks. No. Greenskins have their own language that they speak amongst themselves, although many authors either don't know this or don't care that that's the case, or sometimes they occasionally use it, but they definitely have their own greenskin language, and they can and have the capacity to learn other languages. Indeed, some hoary old orcs, some of whom are not just old, they're like centuries old, some of the oldest orcs on Warhammer, and many goblins have shown that they can speak Reichspiel or Bretonnian or some of the local language, because they learn them from the individuals that they capture, or they learn it through some other route, perhaps because they're taxing merchants that are passing through, and because they're taxing them, they pick up the core components of what's needed for communication for that, and that turns into, over time, being able to speak their language. So long story short, yes, they have their own language. It's almost certainly innate to their genes. So all orcs and goblins and greenskins et al. Sort of come out being able to speak it relatively quickly. You don't have that baby orc thing where they're sitting there with their baby orc mum, getting taught how to do language. Orcs are not like that on Warhammer, at least. They haven't been for a very long time. They were once. Yeah, they can speak. And will they have spells from various shamans that allow them to communicate? Almost certainly, because there is nothing worse than having a bad guy you can't communicate with. If you're a writer or if you are a roleplay games designer, you are looking to have communication so that conflicts and core misunderstandings can be both pushed into the center and communicated in some way, because it makes the stories often more interesting, as do the misunderstandings and miscommunications that can occur. So communication is often a core for driving story forward, or the miscommunications. So you'll find that many writers are at heart desperate to ensure that whatever they have can communicate with each other through one fashion or another. Hey, Hendrik Veerbeek as your shadow. Thank you very much. Enormously appreciated. A PC in my campaign will join the J. Griffin. I seek to influence her by whispers of Akold, reaching her through Barakul. Oh, interesting. I will switch the blade with a relic of Akold's from a previous life. Any tips for adding Akold to the enemy within? Okay, so Akold Hellbrass is an interesting character, Zinch leaning. But the question itself is, how would I incorporate? So this is one interesting way, using the blade as having once been Akold's, and using that to have Akold whispering. Akold is not... So I wouldn't like to have it be Akold. If I were doing this, I would take it in a slightly different direction, just so I can give you a different idea to the one you've already considered. Because if I just reiterate what you've suggested and say, yes, do that, I'm not really giving you anything useful. So let's take a completely different angle and see if you can get anything useful out of that. I would be looking for the whispers, as you put it, of Akold not coming from Akold, but instead the influence that Akold has had upon the blade. As in, the blade has not so much got its own sentience, it's just a part of Akold lies within it. This is a very common concept within Warhammer magical artifacts, and you'll find that many of them pick up the essence of who once wielded them. And that essence, in some cases, like Nagash and the artifacts of Nagash, like the Claw of Nagash or the big crown of Nagash or whatever, literally carry a component of his soul, and he communicates through them. But in this case, I don't think Akold's soul would be in there, nor do I think there's any reason why Akold would be popping on special things to ensure that he can communicate through his sword. It just doesn't sort of make sense. But the horrendous events that Akold has been responsible for, the terrible things that he has done, bleeding into this weapon and giving it almost a sentience of its own that is close to Akold's and believes to a degree that it even is Akold, could be much more interesting, because you could almost have a over-characterized, almost a hyper version of it whispering from the blade that Akold himself is utterly unaware of, particularly if you can be successful at converting someone to Akold's point of view, bringing them to Akold, and Akold having absolutely no idea what this idiot is talking about and having nothing to do with it. So perhaps go in a slightly different direction, do exactly what you're doing, but break the link between Akold and the influence of Akold, allowing you to have a little bit more leeway as a GM with the stories that you're building, where the sword and what it's doing can stand quite separate to whatever you decide to do with Akold. Because ultimately, what you decide to do with Akold and the enemy within is kind of up to you. It's hard to give a suggestion, because the enemy within is sadly, even in its current state, as it was with first edition, very much a fixer-upper. It's a campaign that you generally will need to massage into the place that you want it to be, and it's difficult to speak directly to what you might have done to do that. So for me, that's probably what I would do. So get all of the nasty corruption and the horror that that blade could represent, but leave it with the blade and break that link, allowing you to then do whatever you wish with Akold, and possibly, if you can get the best outcome, have that PC approach Akold expecting to be known and not being known, which would be pretty horrific. Yeah, that could potentially work if that went well. Yeah, I can just spinning different ways. Again, we don't have Sotek this week because I was ill and he thought I was ill, and he hasn't turned up because it's my fault. So I pinged him far too late in the day and he didn't realize I was here, so he's clearly gone off to do his own thing. So we're not doing Lorebeards. Instead, it's just me answering questions about random Warhammer things. So if there's any point of lore that you would like to discuss, bring it up in the chat. Drew Sapphire. It's like Lucifer. Drucifer. It could be pronounced so many different ways. Apologies if I said it wrong. Thank you very much for the super chat. Is there a way to have more than 5 people play Dark Deeds? If I have more than one copy, does it allow for 10 people? Okay, I'm doing the balance. So, Dark Deeds has a turn-by-turn mechanic, which means I do my turn, next person does their turn, next person does their turn. So if you go more than 5 players, there tends to be a long wait until you get back to your own turn. And that is a problem if you are looking to incorporate more than 5 players. Because there are limited things that you can do on your turn. There's there's a card that says you can do this. You can go to the pub and, settle down and hide away from everyone, or you can go hit the street and try and rob someone, or whatever else it might be. You've got limited choices, so you tend to find most turns are pretty fast, especially once people know their game, and that whips around quickly. We have played with more than 5, because through the playtesting we played with 6 and 7, and it does, but you get so few cards hitting the street, and you have a much less of an impact upon the street. Now, could you combine 2 and do it with 10? Yeah, you could. There's nothing in the rules that would stop it from working. It would work. You'd need to obviously double up all your decks would be twice the size. Everything would be twice as big with the street at the end. But that game would go on for a long time, and there'd be long periods where you weren't doing things on your turn. I think it sings really works well at the 4 to 5 mark. It also works surprisingly well at 2 and 3. We had a lot of play testing for the second edition, the revised version, to ensure that it worked at 2 players. because a lot of games of these ilk kind of don't. They're designed for 3 players plus, and they sometimes say works with 2, but it sort of doesn't. But it very much does work with 2. But more than that, I'd say that would be stretching it, Drucifer. But if you wish to do so, give it a go. I know I certainly like giving that sort of thing a go frequently because I like trying out different things with games. I'm a constant tinkerer. Let me just double check I've not missed any from Twitch, because Twitch is rude, and I did miss one. There's Phil. Okay, there's one I've missed from Twitch. Naughty Twitch, trying to hide away its comments. Hey, Phil. Thank you very much, by the way. So we all know you're not a very big Phil fan. I suspect a lot of that comes from the fact that you really like his predecessor. That's not the case. Worth noting, I think Thyras Gorman's great, but it's not that. What can you tell us about old Thyras that makes him so much better? He isn't better. He's an extraordinarily interesting character, definitely not better. How he was eventually lost in the shuffle, and which is a shame, and how he could be used in the setting in the future. So Thyras Gorman was the Bright College of Magic patriarch, and as I'm saying this, I've missed another one. I'm just going to highlight that to myself so I don't miss it as I go back down. From Twitch. Twitch is a naughty one. Let me just bring that up as I go. There, I see people moving in the background. You can try and sneak through there, Mrs. Law, without being spotted. You are sneaking in. I saw you. Creeping out. Anyway, so Thyras Gorman was the Supreme Patriarch of the 8 Colleges of Magic, and had been for some time. For at least a decade, if not a couple. He's also a childhood friend of Karl Franz. And that's something that is forgotten in many of the sources. The pair of them get on like a house on fire, and they get on really well, meaning that unlike many of the emperors who are strongly influenced by the cult of Sigmar, Karl Franz has been strongly influenced by the ideas of the College's magic right from when he was young, and he is accepting of them in a way that other emperors often haven't been, because his bestest mate Thyras, who is older than him and a strong influential figure upon the younger Karl Franz, has always been there. And that's something that I think is easily forgotten. And is, if you're looking for a nice fun core fact about Thyras Gorman, to bring back the original comment there, which I think was, no, that's not that one. I've lost your comment there, Phil. Is it there? There it is. There's Thyras. But he isn't better. He's different. And I think that Gelt brought an awful lot of interesting new stuff to the party. I just don't think that everything that he brought was at all explored, leaving us with an interesting character that if we ever reach 10k subscribers over on YouTube and LAWhammer, I will discuss at length. That being the case, if you haven't subscribed to LAWhammer over on YouTube, do pop over there and click subscribe, because we really need those subscribers, because algorithms apparently. So if you just sit and watch us each week but don't subscribe, please do subscribe, because it makes a big difference to how YouTube handles our accounts. So that would be lovely. I'm going to bring up Mornington Crescent's comment there, because we missed that one earlier. If you were asked to voice something in Total War, what would you want to voice, and why is it Thanquol? I don't get, apparently, a choice there. Yes, I would voice anything. I love voices. I love messing around with voices, as anyone who has watched LAWhammer will know. Although often in the spur of the moment, I lapse into like 5 or 6 relatively core ones when we're doing LAWhammer, just because it means that I don't need to think too much. But that's not true. There's so many different ones. But Thanquol has been an absolute joy to portray in that game. And yes, it would be an absolute honor and privilege to do something like that. I would have so much fun with that. I love Thanquol. He's proper crazy. Sure, Thanquol. Although I would like to see a greater diversity of accents in Total War in general, because they have got a whole host of very diverse characters, all sounding like they come from England, which is an absolute shame, given many of them clearly shouldn't do, because they're, say, for example, from the Far East, and they give them English accents, which is, from my perspective, not great. But I know that we all have different opinions on that, and that's also cool. Okay, so I think that's me caught up in the Twitch ones I missed, so let's move back to Necromancer Kobold. Thank you very much, Necromancer Kobold. deeply appreciated. Happy birthday to me. And again, if you're expecting to see Sotek, this is my fault because I was ill and didn't tell Sotek that I was definitely able to do the stream until very close to when we went live, and he didn't realize, so it didn't turn up, so hasn't turned up, sadly. So we will be doing the Ghoul stream next week. When you were discussing the Magic College, you mentioned that the high concentration of Actuate along with Ulgu can drive Altdorf to riot. Yes. How would high concentrations of the other ones tend to affect people you rock, by the way? Right, so this is a discussion that I've been meaning to have for ages, as in, what do the winds of magic do? And how do they manifest? And what causes them to occur? And I keep on promising to do a stream on this, and I think I'm going to have to, because it's a subject that even the writers of Warhammer sometimes get a little bit wrong. And that's a shame, given how it's core to the setting. And many, particularly the Age of Sigmar crowd, forget that it was all established in old Warhammer. And each of the winds massively change how people react. And each of the winds have got different tones and flavors and how they impact not just the way that people will interact with the world around them, but the world itself. Ulgu, for example, which causes the great rising of mists. They are empirical mists. The great fogs of Altdorf rising up, which come hand in hand with the Ulgu that goes with it. Which came first, the chicken or the egg in this case? Was it the Ulgu or the fog? And it's often a nice mixture of redoubling of both. The great fire of Altdorf was both a mixture of issues with Actuate. In fact, the fires wouldn't go out because the Actuate was drawn to the fires. So the fires just kept on burning. And yes, each of the winds do things that make people react differently. Massive onrush of the Jade Wind, Gyron, the Wind of Life, does things to people that you would largely expect if you consider the word life. It fills them with lust. It fills them with an urge to procreate. It fills them with an urge to express themselves fully in terms of life. And that's not just fucking per se. That's all manners of overindulgences that can pop up. And it's a wind that in some previous editions was relatively closely attached to Slaanesh for relatively obvious reasons. Similarly, and this surprises a lot of people, originally the purple wind was the wind of Slaanesh. That might surprise a lot of you out there. It absolutely was originally, if we go back to the very first iterations of it. That became the wind of death, even though it always had the connotations of the wind of death right from the beginning. It also had a whole host of overindulgence aspects added to it. That got removed, and instead we're left with a dry and dusty wind, one that leaves groups of people left to quiet moments of contemplation, the need for self-isolation, for being alone. If anything, the opposite of the indulgence of the Jade Wind. You instead become almost aesthetic by comparison. And oh, there's so many cool things we could discuss about them all. Now, the problem here, Necromancer Kobold, is that all of the winds have so many facets and there's so much to discuss, I can't do this in a single question. And much like I promised last time, I'm going to promise it again. Let's do a Winds of Magic stream. I'm going to see if I can sort that out before Christmas. I'll see if I get an evening where I'm doing nothing and I can sit down with each one of the 8 winds and have a good discussion about how they manifest, what they do, and what happens when they go out of control. Because this is big, because when the Jade Wind goes out of control, everything becomes overripe and tends to burst, and that's horrible. Much of the worst aspects of Nurgle are tied through to the Jade Wind, absolutely, as they become overripe and pop. So yeah, that wouldn't surprise me either, because Jade Wind, Nurgle seems obvious to me. So thanks for that one, Necromancer. I am unfortunately going to have to probably hold that one to a bit later. Hey, Laughing God, thank you very much for that. Do you know why Kagarak got featured more in 40k than Loic did in Fantasy? Why the name changed? What would you do with Loic if you could? It's an interesting question. I've done a lot with both, and I have conflated them in the past as well, and made them different deities also in the past, because Loic, God of the Dance, has been played around with in a variety of ways that doesn't necessarily make him work particularly perfectly for a Kegarath analog, and that's good, because it gives fantasy a unique feel, and tries to keep the separation in place. As to why they use different names, probably because I think it was Andy Chambers actually who was naming them at the time. Over in 40k. I'm building up the Eldar lore. I'd have to check up on that one. I've just dropped my wedding ring. I'm suddenly not married. I think that was Andy Chambers. I might have to check. But why the name change? 40k often goes in its own direction, and that's for the best. And Warhammer often goes in its own direction, and that's for the best. But I always like the underpinning idea, particularly when we're moving to the realm of chaos, the realm of divinity, et al., of having some sort of shared cosmological space. It works well when handled well. What would I do with Loek if I could? I'd significantly expand them. As it currently stands, Loek's write-ups are poor, sort of tied to the War Dancers, sort of tied to other things elsewhere. I've used Loek in a variety of ways in official publications also. There's a human god, for example, up in Nordland called Loerk, who is also a god of the dance, and we see the close similarities there. In a similar way that up in Nordland, there's another god called the Azure Man, which very closely looks like another elven god too. That's because there is a certain amount of importation of elven beliefs into the beliefs of humans all over the place, and there are certain readers of the work that don't really like that, preferring humanity to have its own discrete pantheon, but that's never been the case for humanity. Right from the very beginning, down in Telia, before it was ever Telia, the elven ruins were influencing the human tribes there, and their first gods that they were learning of there were direct translations of elven gods. In some cases the names were kept, in other cases they were not. An example of a name that was kept is Manan, who was directly popped over to Mathlan, became Manan, or alternatively you have a god like Hoeth, who became the goddess Verena. So there's importation of core god ideals there, and Renald sort of takes up the space of Loek. So I would just, in general, for the elven gods, give them a proper write-up. Their write-up is terrible. And I don't just mean giving them the one-page divinity splash that you get, say, for example, in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4, the core book. I would be looking at a complete write-up. Now, the paths that I'm building for our version in LAWhammer, the paths of the elves, where each of the elves live by and act like one of their gods for a variety of reasons, is one example of how I might perhaps take it in a different direction. Yeah. Wonder Alpha. Thank you very much for that. And again, if you're tuning in expecting to see Sotek, blame me. I told Sotek that I was able to stream far too late in the day, and he didn't realise, so he's not here. My fault entirely. So we're doing an Ask Me Anything About Warhammer goodies. Happy birthday. Thank you very much. I think the Dwarf Pantheon is a bit of a mess. I agree. How would you fix it? Also, that Grimnir and Grundy are not blessed with daughters is bull. Yeah, so... Okay. I don't often do this, unless it's the end times. But I'm going to do this. I think the dwarf lore's shit. Okay, I said it. For the gods. It's just terrible. Absolutely terrible. For a species that is so matrilineally defined, where a species that relies so heavily on its queens because they breed so many men, the clansmen, their reflection of that through to their religion is terrible. Absolutely terrible. The nature of how they have built their pantheon and the lack of pantheon for the dwarves is awful. And I understand how it came about. It came about because we had a first very early light treatment by Games Workshop, which was, we'll do a couple of dwarfy gods, it'll be fine, and we'll expand it later. And then Games Workshop stopped writing Warhammer stuff for the dwarfs, for the roleplay game. It went out to a licensor, in this case, Hogshead. Hogshead Publishing, run by James Wallace, good friend of mine, he's awesome, commissioned a dwarf book, and in the dwarf book they tried to expand it within the realm that already existed for Warhammer Fantasy Battle, which didn't bother expanding the pantheon because it wasn't needed for Fantasy Battle. They had enough ancestor gods to be happy to fuel an entire army, so they did no further expansion. The roleplay game sort of did, and it basically didn't think about what dwarf society was, given the numbers they were producing, considering the massive number of men and the small number of women, and why that would put the women in a core point of importance as Ancestors. Everybody can trace their roots down through one side, definitely, but not the other. It's a It's an interesting setup that I do not think has been properly explored. So if I was doing the Pantheon, I would build my ancestors, all of them, the core ones, where they came from, what they did, and I would be looking at more than just 3 or 4. I'd be looking at the key ones who right at the beginning and the spread from that point. In the same way that the Bible in the real world somewhat goes to town with who begat whom, the Dwarf Chronicles will be doing exactly the same. If you are you know which one of the ancestor gods you're descended from. Every dwarf does. Every dwarf is tied to divinity. Every dwarf comes from this pure core, and they've got almost this platonic ideal where at the beginning everything was perfect, and then everything that emanates from this perfection at the center has become weaker. Ancestors are great, descendants are, generally speaking, not as cool as what came before. It ties through to the core of their traditional ideas as well. The very first dwarfs were the bestest dwarfs, weren't they? They're the ones who did the bestest stuff, and the lack of that in the lore is, I think, criminal. So I don't often call out a part of the lore that I think is actually bad, but this is one where I think it is actually bad. I'll call out the lore here as being poor, and it upsets me. If I'd still been in control of Fantasy Roleplay when we did that, it would have been a discussion I had at length with whoever was going to be responsible for my dwarf book, which was going to almost certainly be Mad Alfred if he was willing to work for us, which at that point he'd already been working for us for something else, so I presume it would have been fine. I would love to have commissioned that book, got it in place, and it would have been a long discussion for how we could build a Pantheon that I would have also had with Games Workshop to make sure that we built something that was properly reflective of their society. And yeah, it's a bit unfortunate. So thanks for that one, Wanderer. Alpha, good question. Sean Schultz. If a beast wizard of the Empire critical failed a channel test during a storm, oh my goodness, during a storm match and went into a bestial rage, what would happen? Well, they'd be in a bestial rage. That'd be bad. So storms of magic, for those of you who don't know, is when the magics go wild, and almost anything can happen. If they're really bad, the little realm of chaos begins to merge with the real world. And we've had some sort of a reflection of that inside LAWhammer recently, where there was a massive unleashing of magic. So if you want to see one aspect of how that could resolve, watch the most recent episodes. They are, however, bonkers. No other way of putting it. They are properly bonkers, self-indulgence nonsense, which goes totally over the top and is crazy. Then we have something here relatively precise. We have a massive upsurge in the winds of magic. A beast wizard attempts to channel that magic into something and then gets taken over by the magic into a bestial rage. I would have that magic mutate him into something big, bestial, nasty. If it's a real critical failure and you really want to go to town, you can even turn him into an element of that wind itself as it manifests through him and contorts his form into something truly horrific. It depends on how bad that failure is. There's some tables, for example, inside Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4th edition and in 2nd to give you an idea of what happens when you fail spells and things go wrong, either called miscasts or cursives of Zinch or some equivalent. And I would be looking at how bad of a miscast is this. If it's just a bad one and he just goes a little bit wild, turns into a bestial creature, goes into frenzy and starts attacking people, perhaps looks a little bit like a mask of rage or some equivalent. But if it's really bad, have that magic flood through him and make it go proper bad. Turn him into an avatar of Gur, make it true super, super bad. Yeah, that could be super fun. That's one example. Blazing Dragon. Just bringing this one up because he said something important here. Got to leave my constant comment, like and subscribe. Thank you very much. He's going to be watching it later. Great to see you here. But yes, do please like and subscribe. Makes all the difference. And again, for those of you expecting to see Sotek here as we discuss ghouls, sadly, he could not turn up this week because I didn't tell him that I was going to be here. Because I was so ill yesterday and I slept in too almost the time when we went live. I didn't tell him that I was definitely coming. And then when I woke up, I immediately messaged and said, I'm okay, we can go. But sadly, he was not there and has not turned up. My fault entirely. Elijah Snow. On centaurs, I think it's kind of neat that most indigenous life in the Warhammer world is actually hexapodal. Zotes, centaurs, dragons, dragon ogres. Yes, and sadly it's not. And the more you look into it, the more you realize it's not, because we also have things like Fimmer, which are supposedly indigenous. I would prefer they weren't, because I agree with you. I think it would be better if there'd been a bit of consistent world building here, and if the core of what was once in the Warhammer world was, as you say, hexapodal. And that for me would be great, particularly if you look at what the root of that is over in 40k. The root of that in 40k is for your Zotes and your dragons, well, your Zotes most definitely, and your Gene Stealers, and your Tyranids, which makes for an interesting birth story. And I've actually done that as one of my Warhammer games. It's the only reason I bring it up, where, yeah, it's a thing. That's a really stupid fact you could do nothing with, and I recommend you don't. Darthu's Manservant, thank you very much. Happy birthday, Andy, and thank you very much. Rapance has become one of my favourite Bretonians. I think she's great. If you were to update her, would you make her a Grail Knight? How would you justify the Lady resurrecting her? No, I wouldn't make her a Grail Knight. I would do something different. There is this desire to homogenize everyone, to make everyone this thing, because that's the best thing, right? So I want that one to be that thing. I absolutely wouldn't. I would build a unique tale, something that makes her unique and interesting, and not another superhuman Grail Knight. But that in no way means that she is not as important or as core, or perhaps even more important than some of the Grail Knights, and why. So I would basically take a look at what was a relatively poor Joan of Arc, Joan d'Arc tale, and look to build something from that made her super unique and interesting, and possibly even justifies her coming into Total War, because there is nothing to do that as it currently stands. And I think I would quite like to marry that tale together in a fashion that allowed her to exist there in a way that's not just magically a Rapance appears. So yeah, I think loosely I would be looking to basically rewrite her story and give her a unique version of who she is that matches the current lore for Bretonia, not what it was as it was originally created back in the 5th edition of Warhammer. So yeah, I'd be looking to update her. Charles CK, thank you. Greenskin pants, do they sew, steal, or both? Yes, they do a lot. There's more than one iteration of examples where orcs and goblins are doing all manner of manual tasks that are effectively service orientated, creating stuff for others. And whether that's down to their obvious weaponsmithing, the clothes that they make, the huts that they build, all the rest of it, they have a definite society and community that's often forgotten about when we discuss it outside of the roleplay game, and often in the roleplay game it's also forgotten about. So they do this, but they also steal. They also have slaves. Don't forget that greenskins are a slave taking species in many of their tribes, not all. Some of them refuse to do it. Some tribes refuse to have a mixture of different greenskins. Some tribes enslave each other, so they will enslave orcs or goblins or something else to do their work for them. And if we go by the standard version of what orcs and greenskins are, these enslaved orcs never really get the benefit of all the combat and the beefing up. So these are relatively emaciated, thin orcs in comparison to what we're used to seeing. Orc society is much more than just these warriors that sit in the front face. The tide that is at the front of the Wa, there's also, believe it or not, a greenskin civilization sitting behind them. As ridiculous as that is to consider, given how much the orcs are always given almost a one-dimensional view. But as we covered in our stream concerning, was it Black Crag? I think it was Black Crag that we covered. Was it? Someone can correct me in the comments. There is mighty and multiple examples of orc civilization where they literally have kings ensconced in a place, and they're taxing and they're doing stuff established within the lore, even with core orc characters. Well worth doing that one. Okay, Bear Metal. I don't know how to pronounce your name. Apologies. How badly would you play? Would you play Warmaster redone akin to? Warmaster. I love Warmaster. Warmaster was a game that came out when I came back to Games Workshop for the second time. I was managing the Edinburgh store when it was released, and somewhat tied to the release of, Repans de Lanes, we went to watch, before the game was released, all my staff, we went to the cinema and we watched the Joan of Arc film. It was the one with what's-her-face in it, Mila Jovovich. And we went to watch that because that was deemed to be suitably Warhammer-esque for us to all be amused. And we sold out completely of Warmaster on day one and sold out whenever it came into the store because the game was amazing. It was a game, though, that always felt to me like it had been stymied. A game that its core mechanics were literally brilliant, but weren't taking advantage of the scale, because we have ourselves Warhammer at tiny little epic scale. But we're not making advantage of giant dragons and crazed war machines and the massive things that you could have at that scale. It was all just basic troops. It was a good war game, but it wasn't really a good Warhammer game, for all it was set completely within Warhammer and gave us all the Warhammer troops. And it wasn't, for me, a good Warhammer game because it missed out on all the cool Warhammer shit that we could have on that scale. And for me, it was doubly an issue because I just, in between my two spates of Games Workshop, I'd worked for a company called Target Games, and Target Games had a game called Warzone, another one called Chronopia. They're equivalent of 40k and Warhammer. Warzone even got its own movie with Ron Perlman in it, which to this day makes me really laugh because it was bad. And they were in the process of building their equivalent to Warmaster before Warmaster was released. And they had art by Adrian Smith. Now, if you know Adrian Smith, he's a freaking amazing artist from Games Workshop's early days. And he came back to Games Workshop when Target Games closed. I also left Target Games when it closed. Just before it closed, if I'm being honest. And he went back to Games Workshop and did all the army box sets and all the artwork for all of the box sets for Warhammer on the front. Anyway, Adrian Smith had some amazing artwork for enormous war machines, truly huge religious things which are carried by hundreds, huge monsters. And I came from that to Warmaster, which was tiny little units, and it just felt small. Nevertheless, I loved the game, and I would love to see it redone, and I would love to see it reimagined. I think the game was amazing. It does, however, feel like a game that was not really wanted by Games Workshop. It went by the wayside. It wasn't speaking to its core audience in 40k, and it seems to have been just largely ignored. I sort of hate that, because I really loved that game. Little tear. And again, if you're expecting to see Loremaster of Sotek, he's not turned up because of me. I said I was ill yesterday and may not turn up today, and didn't wake up until just before this stream started, so he presumed that I wasn't going to be able to make it today, and of course I could, and I messaged him, but sadly he'd already gone, which means he didn't turn up this week. Apologies to everyone for that, so we're just doing Ask Me Anything instead. Jonathan Scott says, so if a human and a ghoul did the nasty, and somebody got pregnant, this is a good one, would the baby be a ghoul, a human, or some sort of half-breed? Asking for a friend. So, first, ew. We'll be covering some of this in the ghoul stream, which I presume will be next week. Ghouls are fascinating, some really interesting things about them, but they are alive, and yes, they are a debased, devolved version of humanity, and they can crossbreed with humanity. And I think, Jonathan, I wouldn't like to make a hard rule on this, or a hard reading. My answer to that would be, would it be a ghoul? Maybe. Would it be a human? Maybe. Or some sort of half-breed? Probably. I think all of those could be the case, and what makes for the most interesting story is almost certainly going to be what is used by an individual writer or an individual GM. If, for example, it appears fully human and seems to be completely human, but as it ages it sort of starts showing some recidivistic qualities, that would be cool. Or perhaps it's atavistic right from the very, very beginning, which would also be kind of cool. Perhaps it's a full ghoul, perhaps it's not. Perhaps it eats its way out of its mother in an absolutely horrible fashion. There's lots of different ways this could be answered, and I think, Jonathan, that the best answer to this is what furnishes the story at hand best. And if you just want to have an answer without a story, it could be all of the above. Hey Phil, thank you very much for the cheer over there. Speaking of cultural appropriation, how would the Naga fare in your mind? They are far more positive figures in mythology in Warhammer, being gods of prosperity, knowledge, and mythological ancestors in a lot of Southeast Asian peoples. It's actually my concern where they might get turned into monsters in Warhammer, which would be unfortunate. I think... See, cultural appropriation is in some instances massively overblown, in other instances massively underappreciated. It's one of those things that really annoys some people, makes other people just groan. But there is something to be said about this, keeping it nice and blunt. I come from an imperialistic nation that went around the world, kicked in other people, took all their stuff home, and took, amongst that, their people as well. And then later on, writing about those people, making money out of it while the people at hand simply don't, and then making weird versions of their society that's entirely stereotypical and a bad reflection and makes them look monstrous or stupid is just icky. It's just like, dude, do it better. And I think there's no way that this can't be done well. In fact, that's a very poor way of expressing it. There's no reason this can't be done well. And the way you do it well is with good research, by getting people involved who come from those cultures and who understand them. And then the reason I think this is important, I'm going to give a real life version of why this I feel is important. I'm Scottish, as any of you out there likely know. And I grew up in the very north of Scotland for most of my life. I lived in different places. My father was a lighthouse keeper, and that meant that he moved to different lighthouses at different points, and I moved following whichever light he happened to work in. But most of my younger years and teenage years, I grew up in a place called Thurso at the very north of the country. And Thurso has a host of local ghost stories, a host of local stories about various, let's be honest, mythical creatures and gods. A lot of Viking influence up there as well. Tons of ancient lore about one castle or the next castle. And none of this is really available on the internet. Not a single bit of it. It's in no massive book that you can easily buy. It's all part of the cultural exchange that happens with the people that live there. Now, in the local primary schools and high schools, they're teaching about local stuff, but it's very hard to find outside of that local area. And I was speaking to, of all people, Graham Davis. Now, you might know Graham Davis from all of his work on Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 1, 2, and 3. He's Warhammer Fantasy 4, Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay God. He started much of what we understand as Warhammer. He created the pantheon of gods in Warhammer as we know them. He created chunks of what Warhammer is today. And he was writing a book on mythological creatures and entities for a completely different game. And he was mentioning a bunch of the stuff that he'd taken from Scottish lore. Now, he loves his mythology and lore, and he was drawing upon what he had read about. And his stuff on the English lore was very strong, but I found his Scottish stuff pretty weak. And his Scottish stuff was what everyone says about Scottish lore, but it was missing this huge screeds of stuff. And I said, did you consider this and this and this and this? And he was like, I've never even heard of those. And he is very much an expert on myth. And he didn't know any of the bits that I was bringing up. Then Lindsay, my wife, she brought up a bunch from where she grew up, which was much further south, down near Forfar. All manner of Roman myths tied up with a lot of where that particular part of the world is concerned. And it used to be the centre of the kingdom of the Scots. And it has a whole host of, again, different myths, none of which Graham was aware of. And that is what you really want when you're transporting really cool stuff from someone else's culture into something that's fantasy. You want to have all of this cool flavor that you don't get if you just do a bit of research and are a good writer. You want all of this moved in and used, because that is where often the real flavor of those individual peoples comes from, and an understanding of what you can and can't do with certain things, because it is in that culture seen to be offensive or not offensive, because you don't want to offend anyone, but you definitely want to make them go, how fucking cool is this thing? And the best way to do that is have either a writing team that includes people that have that, or a team that's being advised by them, and all the cool ideas is given to the writing team, and the writing team can then sift through it all and write it out, pass it back to them and say, what do you think of this? So all of that bundles up as a long way of saying, yes, there's tons of cool stuff that we could have, and there's no reason it shouldn't be and can't be cool. But if they just do it themselves in a bunker as a bunch of people who are just reading other people's myths online and translating them over and adding Warhammery bits, they'll almost certainly make some mistakes, because that's what happens. And it'd be far cooler if they had people involved who were experts on that particular set of myths in those real world myths, so that they could then say, how about this? For example, when we're building the Nippon version that we have in LAWhammer. That's all coming not just from Sage, who is obviously half Japanese. So it's also coming from her family myths, a whole host of really cool shit that she told me about, that she grew up with, that she was aware with, and we're translating all of that together into a really fun version of Nippon for the LAWhammer games, which of course is 100% just for our games. Alrighty, Jonathan Scott. So I already did this one. I can go past that one. Hey, the Blow Person. Thank you very much, the Blow Person. What's your favorite joke from your games that you'd like to get into canon? Example, in my game, we have a chain of dwarf bakeries called Greg's. Sadly, most of mine, at one point or another, I've written so many of them in. It's actually hard to determine which ones. See, I don't just do jokes. We also do largely influenced by Graham Davis, to bring up Graham Davis again. We're also strongly influenced by cultural memes of the day, and by people who are in popular culture of the day. A single example of that, so you can understand where that comes from. If we go back to one of the most famous Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay first edition adventures, that's Rough Night at the Three Feathers Inn. All of the characters from that were Graham basically riffing on real world people. There's a big, huge judicial fighter type who's called Bruno Frank, who's just Frank Bruno the boxer, who's very famous in Britain in late 80s and into the 90s. Very, very famous. And you'll find that there's a lot of that. I have tons of that all the way through both my writing and the parts. I wouldn't say I have a favourite joke that hasn't already made it into the canon. And even right down to when we were discussing, there's so many stupid ones. It's funny the things that pop up into your mind. I was remembering when I was doing an article for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 2, and we were discussing about the different porters. Porter is a stevedore. These are people who port stock from ship onto dock, or from dock onto ship. An exceedingly skilled job, because you've got to know how to pack all the various stock types into a ship in a way that will allow it to roll and not fall over and kill people. You need to understand weight distribution so it doesn't crush things underneath. It's a surprisingly skilled job. Stevedores cornered the market with their guild for safety reasons, not just for we're a guild and we want to do this reasons. And we were discussing the different types of porter, because this was something that was typically used in, say, for example, London in the 17th and 18th centuries. They were called porters by many. And they had deal porters, for example. And deal porters were the ones that dealt with wood, because they referred to it as deal. And they were the ones that were specialists in handling long logs and planks and understanding how best to stack them and move them safely. Something that your average sailor could never do, and an average labourer could also never do. It's why there was obviously a porters guild. And that being the case, I immediately looked at that and went, well, obviously we're also going to have coal porters, and immediately dropped in a couple of references to coal porters' more famous anything goes type lyrics. The coal porters were known for their anything goes attitude, and I wrote that directly in. So you tend to find that as I'm writing, I can't help come up with little in jokes that most people won't ever spot. If you want to see one place where that proliferates, it's the Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay starter set. Andy Lease did the first treatment of that, and I did the second treatment of that. I wrote some of the bits entirely. He wrote the vast majority of the location parts on the first drafts, and that is just filled, literally filled end to end with references to real world movies, to real world people, to little inside jokes. Oh, it's just literally full of it. So broadly speaking, Broke Person, there isn't one I'd want to port in, because I've already done it, which is a bit mince, I know, as an answer. Charles C.K., thank you very much. Humans or elves, higher magical potential on average? Elves by an enormous amount. Elves, it's not just a matter of time that they have on their side. They also have a significantly higher potential. If we were to go to 40k and do our alpha, beta, gamma, delta style of psychers and pass them over onto Warhammer, most elves start significantly higher on that scale. But individual humans are also individually exceedingly exceedingly high on the scale, and you have frequently freaks, individuals who are significantly outside the norm. Our Thyrus Gormans, our Balthazar Gelts, our Egrim Van Horsemans, all of whom are incredibly powerful in and of their own right. And they manage to do what an elf might do in their long centuries of lifetime. They manage to reach an equivalent level of power, often within 5 to 10 years. But when it actually comes to potential, on average, elves are higher. When it comes to individuals, they're surprisingly close to each other, which doesn't go down very well at all with the elves, which is one of the reasons why what Teclis did with the Colleges of Magic was seen to be deeply wrong by many of the elves back in Ulthuan, because teaching humans how to do it better meant almost certainly their incredibly stupid minds would very quickly lead them into all manner of dark magics, because that's where true power actually lies. In many respects, you use dark magic and Dar, you can do far more powerful things, but with proper training. They did not like this, but Teclis proceeded ahead regardless. Because, that's just how it goes, Right, and Phil. A longer one here. As a fantasy guy, as I look over the top of the comment, why do you feel 40k managed to overtake fantasy in popularity and prominence, and what are your thoughts on 40k in general? I personally feel that fantasy is more varied in tone, factions and locales, and that a lot of the best elements of 40k are ports from fantasy, which is ironic considering fantasy takes place on a single planet, while 40k has an entire galaxy to play with. I have opinions on this, and my opinions come from a strange place, because the answer to this is really simple, and it's not necessarily the reason that you might expect, and it's the staff. Games Workshop staff that made this happen. And I'm going to give you an example. In Games Workshop as a whole, 40k outsold Warhammer significantly, except in one place. Just one, in all of the company when I was working for there. Edinburgh. And in Edinburgh, fantasy massively outsold 40k. Massively. And the reason for that, because the staff loved the game and played the game all the time. And whenever we went to other stores, they were all playing 40k because the staff loved 40k. Because there was things about 40k that appealed to them, where in our shop, the staff there all loved Warhammer. In particular, I adored Warhammer. I was a strong proponent of it. So when we were selling the game to customers and we were building the hobby, we were building Warhammer and 40k equally. But our love for Warhammer meant that sometimes our natural bias led to, if you want to ask which one I prefer, it's Warhammer out of the two. And we had a thriving community of Warhammer players up here in Scotland. Thriving. Where whenever we went to one of the other stores, you found that thriving community was mostly 40k. And we always found that just mental, because Warhammer was a brilliant game with a brilliant background, but it was difficult to collect. And I think this is a second reason, and the more obvious reason. The units tended to be, particularly later editions, pretty big, required a lot of painting, and with 40k you could easily move in a far more skirmishy style battle, and it made more sense. Where the big blocks of Warhammer were unwieldy to move, difficult to play with, and took a lot of painting, expensive to get into. 40k tended to be a little bit easier to get into the first time round. And Space Marines as a concept were easy sells to teenage boys, meaning that almost anyone across the country, if they explained what a Space Marine was, they immediately went, I want one of those, it sounds fucking amazing, particularly if it was being sold by someone who's enthusiastic, which was the case. So broadly speaking, one of the biggest flaws that the company on the retail side made was forgetting to build the hobby with Warhammer. They only built the hobby with 40k because it was easier. And because of that, 40k just got leaps and bounds ahead of Warhammer. And then, as we all know, the novels really pushed forward hard on the 40k side, because they in turn were selling, and it became a self-fulfilling prophecy until eventually Warhammer just was not selling. But up until when I left, Warhammer outsold 40k always, pretty much, not always, there's a few weeks where 40k would outsell Warhammer, but pretty much consistently up in our store. And you might say, well, that's just one store, and it's not a very important store, Edinburgh. At that point, and contrary to most expectations, there was only one store in the entire company that made more money than us, and that was their biggest store in London. We made more money than the mega store down in Manchester. The Edinburgh store was huge because it is a tourist trap and tourist central, and we we sold to everybody that passed through, but it was a very good store. Lovely. I enjoyed my time there immensely. But broadly speaking, 40k is an easier sell. There are so many cool elements of it that are an easy sell. Warhammer, a harder one, harder armies to build, so it requires proper staff enthusiasm to ensure that it sells through. And in my time when I was in workshop back then, I would say that if I visited say 10 stores, I would say 8 of those 10 stores didn't even play Warhammer. They had them out for basic games, but the staff just didn't play because they were 40k players. And those 40k players built more 40k players and built more 40k players. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. No great surprise that it turned out that way. So to answer your long question there, Phil, which was that one there, broadly speaking, it was more popular because people found it cooler. And because the staff found it cooler and the staff focused on what they liked, it redoubled that, and 40k became, if anything, even more cool. Where when the staff loved Warhammer, as is the case was in our store, it sold just as well as the other one. So it's not a failure of the game or a failure of the setting. It's very much a failure of Games Workshop's pressure to properly build the hobby with Warhammer. And yeah, I'll leave that Games Workshop's feet. And the retail chain in particular, I'm going to call out, which may surprise many, but the business, as in at the very top, the people who make the decisions, they follow the sales numbers. And the sales numbers started falling to 40k, then fell completely with 40k. It was right from the beginning a massive sell. And in time, Warhammer eventually lost out. Halfling classes in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay seem to be a bit comedic. Yeah, it's a bit of a shame. Is there a very non-comedic class that you'd love to see them? Yeah, the Field Warden was always quite a good one, which was basically undead killing halflings, which are super cool. So that's one example of that. One of the problems with halflings is whenever somebody does a career for them, they'll do a fucking joke. And I can't express how annoyed I was with the Badger Rider when it came out for the halflings without being balanced out by some really proper halfling careers. But they pretty much focused on the Badger Rider and left it at that, which I felt was awful because it was a joke career. Pardon me, take a drink. It was a joke career, and they're often just given joke careers, and that lessens them. Now, it's fine to use halflings as a joke in Blood Bowl, because everything's a joke in Blood Bowl. It's fine to use halflings as a joke occasionally elsewhere too. Everything gets played as a joke in Warhammer at some point. But if we only use them as a joke, they become a joke, which means in later iterations, the halflings won't be used because everyone will go, they're just stupid. And that's what almost killed them. There was a reason that halflings weren't in later iterations of the Empire Army list. It's because everyone thought halflings are stupid and they should never have been in the Empire Army anyway. We wish we'd never included them because they're daft. But they're only what you write them. And they're daft because they thought they were daft. And in some respects, that's what guided my version of the gnomes, where I decided not to play on the jokes, because there's so many good jokes with gnomes, but not to play on the jokes for the core of their writing. And I intended to later on expand on it, using jokes and using joke aspects as and where it was appropriate. So, yeah, it's a toughie, that one. Yeah. Maybe you're comfortable. Why are firmer so problematic? Yeah, this is super easy. So, Sir Panza, thank you very much for the question. Firmer are problematic, but many don't think they are, even when they take them at their worst examples, and I will explain why. And I've discussed this at length behind the scenes. When the Firmer were first created, they were created as the ultimate bog demon bad guy. And the Fimmer, had no women, except for some of their sorceresses. They bred by taking women from other species and raping them. And that is nasty. And that brought about more Fimmer. It was never explained why this was the case. It was just, this is our evil, cackling bad guy Fimmer. And now I know the person who created them. It was Graham Davis. And I sat down with Graham and I said, do you think this is problematic? And Graham went, yeah, I wish I hadn't made it. I really wish I hadn't done that. I wish I'd done something else. I wish I'd allowed it to be a part of their culture, but not to be literally the defining component of what their culture was. Because their defining component, their drive was to make raids into other communities and take their women folk. And it was pretty much a problematic thing. Now, you might go, yeah, but you could get some cool stories out of that. You know, assuming you've got a group that's happy to deal with sexual assault as a core component of it, and some groups are, and I would never say that other people's tables should follow my table, for example. My games in the past have dealt with themes of sexual assault, rape, and various other things, which obviously we're not doing online because it's pretty difficult. But we definitely have done it at our own home tables, and we've had discussions about it to make sure everyone's happy about it. As long as you're open about how you deal with things, sometimes they can be very good stories, particularly for people who might not understand what is involved with it and how it is as horrific as it is. I'm not going to dwell on this. I have literally heard a story. This is not me exaggerating or making a story up to try and make a point. I was told this. I was at a con and a woman came up to me and asked me about the inclusion of the Fimmer in the 4th edition of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. And the inclusion was not my choice. I was happy to see them because it's always good to have that old stuff reappear. And I did not make any mention to the roots in it, but there's still a part of me that went, I'm not sure I'm happy with it. I'd like to do something to make sure that this is dealt with well rather than poorly. And there was no space. It was just a single little bestiary entry. So I was always a bit uncomfortable with it. And I said, they're there. And we had a bit of discussion. And she said, right, so I have a problem with this. And I was like, okay, go. And she said, right, so I was at a table and my GM decided to rape my character. And I was in a group of all boys and they were all laughing about it and they thought it was funny. And the loss of agency there was horrific. I stopped role-playing and I didn't role-play for about 4 or 5 years after that because it was traumatic. And I was like, well, holy shit. That's utterly awful. Unacceptable for any table. She didn't expect it. There'd been no discussion about it. They just did it to her. No, we're almost playing dirty little fantasies out at her feet, which is horrific. Terrible. It caused trauma for her. They had no idea what they were doing because they were kids. And I don't blame them for this because they were taking something that was in the game. They were playing with it to its natural conclusion, and they were young, and they made some pretty foolish mistakes, and they didn't realize what they were doing. I don't really blame them either. I blame the writing, because they presented a thing, and they did not say, this has to be handled with care, because if you don't handle this with care, you can hurt people. And I mean hurt people at a game where we're all meant to be having fun. And if you end up causing trauma in one of your players, something's gone wrong. And that's why I'm uncomfortable with the Fimmer. Because the Fimmer, at their core, always have this, and you can't erase where they came from. And at their heart is an entire species that's based upon sexual assault and rape. And even when they're rewritten into something else, it's still there, which is why it was an almost controversial inclusion in Hero Quest. But in some respects, Hero Quest, when it came out, which was a big board game by MB Games, which included Fimmer, sort of almost made them okay, because it made no mention of it. They were just a bad guy that you could kill, and that was fine. And I do think that they are redeemable. I in no way think they should be removed from the setting. I think that they should be handled maturely. And I think that all the darker aspects of them, which Games Workshop probably will never touch again, could easily be incorporated if handled maturely. But it has to be handled well, which is why I'm uncomfortable, because it hasn't been previously handled well. They've either handled it badly or they've just ignored it and pretend it doesn't exist. And both outcomes, I think, are not the best outcome. So I hope that explains it all to you in a way that doesn't make you go, oh, fuck off, Andy, that's shite. I will never forget, that was at Essen, that woman and her discussion concerning it, because it repositioned where I sat concerning the Fimmer. I'd been always a bit uncomfortable with how I could best use the material in anything official, but upon hearing that, I was like, well, it needs to be properly handled if we're doing it ever. And at that point, I was the producer for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. I much prefer the older lore where they were kind of Warhammer Nephilim. Also, what did you mean by the Tyranid Zot thing regarding their origin? Okay, so I'm not quite sure what Knievel you're meaning by the Warhammer Nephilim. Do we mean the old ones? Or something else? And what do we mean by the Tyranid Zot thing regarding their origin? So Zotes are, in origin, broadly speaking, Tyranid, and they're in the Warhammer world. That's up to you what you deal with. That's entirely up to yourself. they got rewritten for Warhammer. Rewritten for 40k, rewritten for Warhammer on more than one occasion, but I decided in one of my games that that connection was still in place. And if you look at what the Zotes originally were, which is effectively Tyranid ambassadors before the Swarm, it suddenly pictures them in a very different place when they arrive in the Warhammer world. And that was just purely for that game. I do not recommend you use this in the slightest. And again, I'll make one more comment as we're heading towards our second hour. And if you're here expecting Loremaster of Sotek to be here, sadly, it's my fault he's not. He's not here because I was very ill yesterday and gave him a quick ping and said that I probably won't be able to make it today, but I might. And I didn't wake up until about 20 minutes before the stream went live. And I sent him a quick message saying I can make it. But by that point, I think he'd already decided, no, Andy's clearly not turning up. And almost certainly rightly so. So sadly, he's not here this week. We will pick it up next week, I hope and presume. So yeah, let's move on. I presume that's what you meant there regarding Warhammer Nephilim. Do confirm that as we move down. I might need to actually check the comments a bit closer from Nuke and Evil as we move on. Aleph Flux, hey, thank you very much. You mentioned on and off about wanting to do more about non-counts Kings Undead. Yeah, tell me about it. Tell me about your take on natural White Kings. Right, so natural, that's an interesting comment. There's a host of these already inside the 8th edition army list. They are discussed. When you go through the crypt stuff, there's a massive mention of all the stuff that and the ancient civilizations that live down in the vaults down the Black Mountains in the south of the Grey Mountains, and how there's all manner of barrows and barrow wights and the like that live down there. And these are a core component of the undead across the old world. Loosely speaking, the vampire counts are what the army focused on, but liches are a core component of the old world as well. Necromancers who continue on in undeath. They are not purely the Tomb King's province. They are something that are old world. Necromancers and the great position that they hold outside of the Tomb King's army, although you can make somewhat of a Tomb King, a Necromancer army using the vampire army list, it's pretty poor. So I would be looking at just building undead for the old world as a whole, because there are all manner of barrows and wights and ancient kings from times past who have managed to, through the dowsing of magic, I'm saying on the importantly lines, are old religious rites, never die properly. It's not simply a Tomb King thing, it is a Warhammer thing. And I very much would love to see that reflected, even if it was just a reskin of the Tomb King's army, allowing you to have an old world White King army with old Celtic style undead doing their crazy thing out of the old world. There's no reason that couldn't be the case. They're constantly described in a variety of different sources. The number of times in novels that characters stumble upon an ancient barrow that is filled with undead from times long past, there's nothing to do with Nagash, although sometimes it might be. There's nothing to do with the great spells of awakening, although in some cases it might be. Sometimes it's to do with Drachenfels, sometimes it's to do with just the natural winds of magic in the place. There's all manner of cool tales we can tell. So cut a long story short, I'd like to see more undead. Very much so. Raw Cyan, the Lime Bear. Is there enough centaur lore to make a Lorebeards episode? Yeah, there's enough. There's barely any. There's enough that I could probably pull together a good chat about it. Yeah, Sotek and I had a big long discussion about whether we could do Dragon Ogres, and I'll admit our big long discussion was like 2 minutes worth of, can we make this an actual episode? And I went, well, we really only have one source that's been copy pasted, but the implications of that source are enormous. So if we look at it, probably, and then when you take in there's like 1 or 2 special characters, and we look at those and what their implications are, I reckon we can easily have that for a 3-hour stream. And we were not wrong. We got a really good stream out of that. So we like taking on subjects that don't have a lot of lore written there, because often the less lore there is, the less it's been over detailed, meaning that they've often used broad brushstrokes, and those broad brushstrokes have implications. And in this case, I think we could definitely get a stream out of it, especially when we consider the impact it would have on early Kislev Kislev, the impact it would have over Nagaroth. There's all manner of cool stuff. We can also discuss where the Centaurs were right in the very first versions of Warhammer, because Centaurs have been around right from the very beginning in Warhammer, and they have been reimagined in various ways down through the editions. So yeah, I think we could easily get an episode out of them. Agar 89. How would of like the dwarf steam tank that was almost released for 8th edition but was cut right before release? Also, how scary about very. Okay, so how would I like a dwarf steam tank? I think that dwarves have been written by two very different styles. On one hand, we've got deep traditionalists who don't like newfangled stuff. And they create people like Burlock Damonson, the great dwarf engineer who got so frustrated that, well, you know, he went off on one. And then we have dwarfs who are only interested in tinkering and making cool new shit. And they make new shit. And I think both can exist. But I think that whenever they focus on one, they forget the other. And the steam tank or an equivalent, or even our big flying zeppelins and our big flying boats and similar, they're often a bit of dial it up to 11-ish each time as it goes to 12 with the next iteration, 13 with the next one. And they often forget what lies at the core of dwarf creation, which is tradition and returning to the past. And, you know, doing it the right way, particularly with the guilds. Which is one of the reasons why I was never quite so happy with the enormous changes that were made to the dwarves, claiming that they're new innovations, rather than the enormous changes being made to the dwarves with the later editions saying that these are things that they've rediscovered or they've attempted to recreate from the past, which has always been the better line for me for dwarves. So my loose answer on this one is I'm always happy with new cool dwarf stuff. I've even written some of it into the lore myself in some places, bringing up the idea of mechanical golem-like creatures that have been created by the dwarves in the past during their wars. But I do like it making sense within dwarf psychology and society, which is often forgotten about. Also, Black Orcs are terrifying. Absolutely terrifying. And yeah, the Lizard Boy didn't show up. It's just Elf Lover Boy still. Although I'm not really sure I'm an elf lover. But if that's what you think, sure. I'm kind of an everything lover, more of a pan Warhammer guy. I remember someone told me in the 1990s that the old world was a planet close to the Eye of Terror and was in the 40k universe. Is that true? It absolutely isn't, but it absolutely was for some. This was a common thing that was said through the 90s, particularly favoured by Games Workshop staff, who were attempting to justify and understand how Warhammer and 40k could be intrinsically linked in the way that it was. And the most common answer was, it's in the Eye of Terror, often a weird, secluded place, and the dark gods are warring over this planet, and it is in the 40k universe. This, however, was deeply resisted by various figures in the studio who did not want to lessen Warhammer and make it just a part of 40k, which would, in many respects, make 40k the core setting, and Warhammer not its own setting. Warhammer is just a part of 40k, and for obvious reasons that was not well liked, particularly because it also undermined Warhammer as a game. 40k players could just say, you're just a part of Warhammer anyway. But you will note, given what I said in many previous streams, a lot of the staff in Games Workshop were so 40k facing that they loved that. They thought that was a good angle. They were like, yeah, it's just part of 40k. It's all one, the big thing. 40k is the proper setting. The Emperor's out there doing Emperor things. This is just this weird Warhammer thing on the side. It's full of fantasy creatures and is cool. I've painted one army once when I was 12, but I haven't played it since then, and I play 40k these days. And that was the potential outcome of that argument, which is why many pushed away from it hard. But they do share the same cosmology. They are linked through the warp, through one fashion or another, but they are almost certainly not in the 40k universe. Now, does that mean that you couldn't do that in your own games? Absolutely not, because all of the hints and all of the various suggestions that are made by the Warhammer lore makes this a very real potential. There's a reason people believe this. It's because you could easily have that be the case and still relatively closely match 40k and Warhammer lore. So you can do this for your own games. I've done it for my own games, but my version was slightly different, ended up with Warhammer going to war with 40k, which was a super fun end, particularly with Nagash trying to become the Emperor. Good times. I have done some pretty stupid games with some of my personal games at home. Anyone who's watching LAWhammer at the moment will know that things can go a bit bonkers, because the most recent episodes, because there's been a massive storm of magic, have been a bit bonkers, but they've not been 40k bonkers. Any thoughts on Zweihander? So Daniel's a lovely guy, although he did say some rather amusing things at the beginning of Warhammer's release, which weren't strictly speaking true, which I won't go into with any depth. I'll say that Daniel, though, I met him at Essen, not Essen, I met him over at Gen Con, pardon me. I remember when Zweihander first became a thing, Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 2nd edition died a death and just was gone, and then 3rd edition came along and it was a dog's dinner as far as most Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay fans were concerned, because it didn't use the right system. Now, I think that was unfair on a system that could have been something very good if it was given a new edition, but the 3rd edition sort of crashed and burned in many areas for the existing fan base. So Daniel moved into that space and said he would try to make himself his own version of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, and he called it Zweihander rather than Warhammer, and he basically built a scrub off the barcodes version of Warhammer, and it's a big book full of rules, and it was certainly an admirable attempt at a scrubbed off barcode version of Warhammer. It's certainly a rule set. It's not one I've ever used. I backed his Kickstarter because I love supporting other people attempting to do their own creative things, but I felt that it didn't do enough that was original. It basically was just being Warhammer. It wasn't attempting to be its own thing. Now, later on, his game's taken a different direction, and that's good. But my thoughts are, well, it's nice to see that it exists. I think that I would have done it very differently if it was me. But it's a fun artifact of when it was created. Baron von Bastard. I love that name. Are there any Skaven characters that could actually be considered vaguely loyal? At heart, no. But yeah, Skaven are a deeply religious species, and they reflect the Horned Rat, who is at his heart not loyal to his followers, and certainly breeds a disloyalty amongst others. That scrabbling rat race to the top, which means at heart, all of them aren't. But I will now give you a different question, and you'll see what I kind of mean as I pose it. Are there any humans that are let's humanity generally is presented as this great adaptable species in most fantasy games, and the similar question would be, are there any humans who aren't adaptable and willing to exist in any environment? And the answer is, well, hell yeah, loads of them aren't. Loads of them are complete cocks. Loads of them would never do any of those things. Loads of them aren't adaptable. Loads of them don't like other people. Loads of them are super xenophobic. In fact, they're xenophobic as a standard. Same for Skaven. Skaven are a species, like any other, which have highs and lows around their basic norm. Their basic norm is followers of the Horned Rat. They are the children of the Horned Rat. That's who they are. But that doesn't mean that some of them are relatively heretical, and it would be heretical to be relatively trustworthy. They are weird Skaven. And yeah, there's weird Skaven out there. There are some that are insanely loyal to whomever it is that they work with. Insanely loyal to, for example, Deathmaster Snick, and his great loyalty to, or is he loyal? So yes, their insanely loyal Skaven is by human standards not loyal at all, but I do think that there are probably some that are really quite loyal, yes. Because everybody is different, and Skaven are, if anything, very prone to mutation and expressing in many different ways. Rockabye Jukebox Fantasy always outsold 40k in Spain. There you go. And the fact that Estalia never got a proper army book and cash in that success is quite stupid. Agreed completely. Yeah, Fantasy outsold Warhammer in a few places, and I remember having discussions about this, particularly when we were at various, the head of retail would be there, for example. So that's the person who was responsible for all of the retail things. He'd be sitting there saying, oh yes, Fantasy outsells 40k in this place, in this place, in this place. And typically they would always call out the Edinburgh store and say, and in the Edinburgh store. And then they'd point at me at a meeting or something. Hey, Andy. And I'd be like, yeah, calling me out again. And yeah, that was a thing that happened. And it did in pockets all over the place. 40k was not universally the most popular system. And in multiple places, Warhammer was more popular. And the fact they didn't capitalize on that is no great surprise, because they were focused on their core market, and their core market became 40k. But I absolutely agree. The lack of fantasy Estalia was understandable. They already had several human species groups, and they already had too many Warhammer armies, a massive amount of detail spread across like 10, 11, 12 armies, all of which had multiple codes, as in multiple blister packs and box sets and similar. And adding another like 10 blister pack sets, another 5, 10 box sets to the shop floor would have been enormous for an entire new Estalia, when they could go somewhere like Ogres, or they could go somewhere like Kislev even, which Kislev's not a good idea, but maybe something a bit different to another old world setup. So it's no great surprise that happened. They chose Lizardmen first. They then chose, because at one point Lizardmen were not existing, and they chose Ogre Kingdoms. They generally chose other things that lay on the outside whenever they went to something new. They, for reasons I still to this day kind of wish they hadn't, they split up the undead and they split up chaos, meaning that we ended up with multiple armies of the same type together, rather than it meant that we ended up with lots of splitting. And I agree with you. I think is ultimately where I'm going to land in this one. You've got a good point. It was a shame that they were not focused on. Let's make sure I haven't missed a Twitch one there. I did not. Were you ever able to get a TTRPG store sponsored link? Oh, I haven't put that up, have I? Good call. And I didn't add that in. Let me add that to my thing. I didn't put that one up, Gaston. Thanks. I've just opened up my notepad, and it's literally point number 2 on my notepad up here. I'm just going to add that in. Link to drive through. Yeah, I'll do that right after this stream ends, and I'll put it into the comments, not the comments, or maybe the comments as well, and the description of this video. So I'm going to leave that right up. I'm going to put it on my screen down here, so I'll put it on my Wacom screen so that it doesn't vanish, because this screen I do much more work on, and I might miss it. So thank you very much for pointing that one out there. Right, moving down. Okay, got there. Avani DK just got home from our traditional family Christmas cookies baking day, and Andy hasn't asked me anything. Great day. Woo! Yeah, that wasn't the plan. As I've said several times throughout the course of this stream was supposed to be a stream with me and Sotek doing ghouls, but Sotek didn't know that I was well enough to do it, because I told him yesterday I probably wouldn't be, and I slept in all the way up to about 20 minutes before this stream went live, meaning that sadly we didn't have the communication beforehand, and he didn't realize that I would be here. Oops. My fault entirely. Nagash is so powerful, says Patrick Mulligan, while spending most of his time destroyed in comparison to Arkan and the OG vampires. What best explains the power difference? Okay. I will go to a different setting. In Star Wars, the Emperor is ridiculous. And that's Nagash. And he may be sitting on his throne or doing fuck all elsewhere, but he is nevertheless significantly more powerful doing his own thing. And now, in the older version of Nagash, he's not out of it, destroyed. He spends most of his time up. I mean, he's out for 666 years or whatever, 1,000 so many years. But he's definitely up in the old times and in the end times, for example. It's not until the end times material that they go, actually, he went down and he's been summoned up again. Yay. He had been active throughout that entire period, manipulating the world and preparing for the end times. And they undermined and broke that story up in the end times, which is one of the reasons why I didn't like the end times, because they rewrote the setting in a less interesting way and made loads of characters do things that they probably wouldn't have done to resurrect Nagash. And it, if anything, made Nagash look weaker, like he had to be resurrected. So the best difference with power is that he is more powerful than all of them at necromancy. He just is. And he has a form that allows him to do magic that is on a higher scale than anyone else. He can literally consume warpstone. Vampires ain't be doing that sort of thing. That's largely left in the more refined versions of warpstone that the Skaven use. And they're crazed magics and they're mental. Nagash has pretty much cornered the market in extraordinarily powerful undead magic. There is no one that comes close to him. They just don't. Arcan is nowhere near him in terms of overall power. He is necromancy. He is the closest that we have probably to a living, unliving god. And truth be told, he is, and this is often forgotten, still alive. Even though his version of life is super, super weird. He is not a lich. He is someone who has rebirthed himself after death. And not as an undead creature per se. He is the Lord of Undeath. There is no death for him. He is beyond the concepts of life and death by his final amount. He is just bigger and better than all of them. But if you want some sort of an equivalent, the Emperor is not a bad choice. And the Emperor of perhaps 40k is not a bad choice. I mean, look at the Primarchs. They're all mental. Surely they're not. No, the Emperor is bigger and better. And it's not necessarily different in that particular case. So, that's a loose answer, but little else I can say. Necromancer Cobalt pops in. I asked this one on Sotek solo Q&A. Oh, interesting. I wonder we'll have different answers. But I was curious about your thoughts since they deserve cliff notes. Noting the, I was curious about your thoughts since they deserve cliff notes, only deserve cliff notes. Mid-cliff noting the pygmies. So, pygmies. Right. Pygmies in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay are not, Warhammer, pardon me, are not a bad idea per se, as in the concept of a pygmy is arguably okay, given that they were real-world people, but they kind of weren't in terms of how they're used in Warhammer. What Warhammer does is it takes the real-world concept of a pygmy, turns them into tiny little black stereotypes, and the artwork for them, it looks like it has escaped from a 19th century racist book of black stereotypes with giant lips and fuzzy hair and tiny eyes with no intelligence, pure barbarians. It is absolutely racist. It's not even slightly racist. It's just a racist, stereotypical view of what it was to be a black person from Africa, and was terrible. The very worst expressions of it were pretty much given as a Warhammer 3rd edition army supplement. And not good. Now, it comes from the 80s. And it was not racist on purpose. This was not racism that was put in place because they were racist people per se. This was built from ignorance. And this was not a bunch of folks going, ha ha ha, we are racist, ha ha ha, come out with various evil, I don't know, white-hatted nonsense. No, none of that at all. It was actually built from a good place, particularly given just how much many of the people who were involved were deep appreciators of African history. It's just that the pygmies in particular were very poorly represented and also played for jokes. So they absolutely deserve to be on the, yes, this happened, they should never be forgotten, because they should be learned from. This is not how you do it. And this is a pure example of how not to do a Warhammer faction, because it was racist and bad. And I'm not laughing because, they were racist. I'm laughing at how awful it is and how obvious it is, and how I had somebody attempt to justify the pygmies as they stood as a good idea. And when I laid out why it was this individual, they were just left going, okay. Because it's just bad, man. So my opinion is, yeah, thanks, no. And I don't think that they should necessarily ever return in anything close to what they were once. But we definitely need deep, awesome, in African-inspired civilizations within the Warhammer world, which are something that can make the Southlands really shine. Because at the moment, they're just big jungles of emptiness and the hints of civilizations that might exist. Do you have thoughts on the Midgard RPG? I don't. I don't even know what the Midgard RPG is. Give me a second, because thank you very much, Jack, for that one. I'm going to have to check to see if I even know the Midgard RPG. Midgard, is that the one from Kobo Press? So Midgard, G-A-R-D, high fantasy with a keen edge, apparently. Explore the dark fantasy world of Midgard. I have not seen Midgard. I am, this may surprise many, not really a great consumer of the broader roleplay market anymore, largely because everything that I've got in my rather extensive library I've either worked on or been given. So if somebody doesn't give me something, I tend not to know anything about it, and I don't pay that much attention to all the new stuff that's been coming out. Do you, in turn, have any opinions on it? If you do, ping me on Discord, tell me what it's like, and if it looks good, I'll probably pick up a copy, Jack. Thanks for bringing it up, but sadly, I don't know. I shall answer this one as well. Sotek was supposed to be here today, sadly, but I didn't tell him I was going to be here until really, really late, by which time he didn't realize I was going to turn up. Because yesterday I was so ill I could barely move. Today I'm obviously sitting here streaming away happily. That was not going to be the case yesterday. And I thought I wouldn't be well enough today, and I told him as much, but I didn't tell him until very late in the day that I could definitely do today. So sadly, he missed that and missed this stream, which means we haven't done the cool stream we're just doing and Ask Me Anything, which has been fun nonetheless. So my fault entirely, blame me, let's just not dwell on that one too much. A certain preternatural priest brings up, hi Andy, minus Sotek. This is mostly a gift since today is my birthday. Wow, we're really, really close. My birthday was just, what day are we on? We're on Sunday, so that was 2 days ago. But I do have a question. Is there a difference between souls and spirits? Are they the same? They are completely different. Very, very different. So souls in typical Warhammer parlance, although it's used by different writers, are the immaterial component of living creatures in the Warhammer world. So everything that's living in the Warhammer world has got a soul, which sits over on the immaterial side, so in the realm of chaos, sort of. And that's a soul. A spirit is something that is either living inside the realm of chaos, the aether, or the realms of the gods, whatever you want to call it. So something that comes from the other side, often called demons when they're dealt with the realms of chaos specifically. And indeed, there might be nothing but demons if you go with certain versions of the background. That's their natural place, and many spirits have come into the real world for one reason or not, because magic has saturated a place. The Lorebeards, for example, is full of spirits, as is Athaloran, as is a variety of parts of the Avalorn, for example, often tied to areas of great woods, because that's the easiest place to reference the stuff that's been made in the Wood Elf army list. But spirits as a whole come to anywhere where magic saturates. So the deepest oceans, the highest mountains, there's all sorts of spirits living everywhere, and that's where the magic is gathered. But they're not the only sorts of spirits, because you also have undead spirits. So these are ones that often live in a shadowlands, a place that lies between the land of the living and the land of the dead. These are individuals who have not passed on, so their souls have not moved on to whatever afterlife is going to be appropriate for them, often because they're clawing to their life for one reason or another due to some trauma that they had suffered from. And there's a variety of different spirits of that type. So they are souls that have not moved on. So is there a difference between souls and spirits? Yes, but there's also a certain amount of marriage between them, because ultimately a soul can become a spirit, but a spirit will not necessarily become a soul, but it can. I'll give an example. Spirits are often bound into material things, creating things like familiars. That means that the spirit becomes the soul of this new material familiar. So there is a big difference between them, and if you go and look at the Niebuhr Necros in particular, you'll find there's different aspects of how souls are built, and the soul includes the material components. Souls are bigger than just spirits alone, but there's a lot of crossover too. It's a complicated thing, which I have very, very briefly skimmed over, but loosely, there's different forms of spirits. Souls are generally the incorporeal parts of living beings, and sometimes there's a certain amount of marrying between the two, and different writers have used the terms in different ways. The Laughing God comes up with a quick, would you rewrite Slaanesh in fantasy as a fallen elven god of the dead, or some such to explain their claim over souls of elves? I would not. I would do something different. But I see absolutely no reason why one would not presume that they are I think the first mistake in this, from my perspective, would be calling them fallen. I don't think they're fallen at all. Fallen to what? They are chaos. There is no falling. They are what they are. They haven't fallen. Anyone that goes along their path are deemed by others to have fallen. But you'll also note that they're the ones that almost certainly win the Warhammer world. Is that really falling? There's very different angles that can be taken. And I think having a moral angle on this, which is it's an in-world moral angle, is a disservice to how I would necessarily approach Slaanesh. Slaanesh is a chaos god and possibly insane, depending upon which version you go with. Possibly very sane, depending on which version you go with. But I would not go with God of the Dead. The Mirai, which is the afterlife of the elves, is not Slaanesh's province, and I don't think ever was Slaanesh's province. The Mirai is absolutely Ereth Kael's, the Pale Queen's, and it should be hers, and I see no reason why she wouldn't be the goddess of the dead in that angle also. She's not the goddess of death. That's very different. That's Morai Heg. And I don't think I would mess with that, because there's really good tales you could build with that without needing to use Slaanesh. Having Slaanesh moving out with what Slaanesh is better than just simply saying this is what Slaanesh always was and is just doing what Slaanesh was doing. I would prefer not to do that. I'd much prefer to see chaos mutate and change and become something new rather than stick with what it always was, which leaves them feeling much more like prime concepts of the elves rather than necessarily mutating chaos gods that they are. So I don't think I would do that, Laughing God. But that doesn't mean you couldn't build a good story with that. And I think you absolutely could, but it wouldn't be my preference. Greg C, a second live stream that I caught. Hey, hope Sotek's all right. I think he's completely fine. He just didn't know we were streaming. As they're not here today, have a lovely day, Andy. I am having a lovely day because I got up like 20 minutes before the stream went live. I had slept all the way through from the previous evening. I have had so much sleep, which for me is actually quite rare. I am absolutely delighted. Mornington Crescent. I'm about to go play Dead by Daylight. Oh, wow, that's an old one. With friends. Asymmetric horror game. Yes, one person hunting for others. Thanks, Michael Myers, or the Alien, or Chucky. Which Warhammer character would be best as a killer in Dead by Daylight, do you think? I haven't played Dead by Daylight for ages. What would make a good, proper stalker slasher? Now, you have the right answer, but it's so obscure no one would really go with it, and that'd probably be the Beast. So the Beast is a character in the movie Beast in Velvet. In the movie? That tells you what I think about it in my head. In the novel Beast in Velvet by Kim Newman from the late 80s, maybe 1990, Beast in Velvet. And it's a serial killer who pretty much does exactly what is required of these, but I don't think it's a good example of that. What you're really looking for is someone that everyone would go, yeah, the Warhammer equivalent of that. Woo! I want to do one of those. And do we really have a really good serial killer? Huh. I might have to rely on chat here because nothing's immediately coming to mind. I'm going through. I mean, you've got assassins and you've got Skaven who creep around and assassinate you. You've got individual characters who represent each. You know, Deathmaster or Shadowblade. Or as you go through all the various factions, they've all got something which is pretty horrific. The undead have more examples than I really need to mention. But I'm not really sure one stands out immediately as the clear, that's the one I'd go for. I think I could just build a good story for all of them. It makes me feel like if I was doing it, I'd want a Warhammer version of Dead by Daylight with maybe like 12 or 13 Warhammer characters that did it, rather than necessarily just one Warhammer character, because it wouldn't feel like it was doing a service to the depth that is Warhammer, and it would make it look like you were saying Warhammer is just this one thing, which it absolutely isn't. I know that's a bit of a cop-out answer, but that I think would feel better for me. Darius Rose, happy birthday, thank you very much. Which creature do you find the most disturbing? For me, it's Gorgers and Bornco. Gorgers are horrible. Disturbing. Disturbing is a different thing to terror, fear. This is something that I think of if I actually met this entity, and this entity was a real entity, it would proper disturb me for the fact that it exists and what it can do. And I'm going for one of the simplest ones. And that's the Daemonettes of Slaanesh. Because they are by their very nature disturbing. not just because they play up that mixture of genders, sexes that just disturb some people anyway, but it's the fact that they can get almost anyone to do what they want. And at its heart, anyone that can control something else is disturbing. And these alien, horrendous creatures, which are akin to Cenobites, if we go to the Hellraiser property, we're probably most of us aware of Cenobites, and they're taking many of the qualities of Cenobites, but they do something that Cenobites sort of don't, and they are alluring. Cenobites are sort of alien, alluring to insane lunatics. And many of the people who seek out the Cenobites in the Hellraiser franchise do so by mistake, not realizing the horror they are about to be unleashing or have unleashed upon them, where the Slaanesh law are worse, because they're all of that and more. And it's the and more, it's the alluring aspect, the fact that many will fall to that because of what they represent. They are, out of all of them, clearly the most likely to cause proper corruption to chaos. And what they could represent to the Warhammer world as a whole, I think, is poorly shapen, because they are the ones who are going to make most folks fall, because they can seduce in a way that the other demons just don't. Take a look at, say, for example, the great corruptor of Tzeentch, and I will corrupt you to my way of thinking. It's all headspace shit, because their demons are not good at this. Even though they might appear in a written description here or there, the core horror, the horror of Tzeentch, which is at the core of the demons of Tzeentch, is a horror, a mutating mess of fire and magic, and not something that you can imagine whispering in your ear about corruption and twisting you to their way of thinking. They're more like the Cenobite, the alien horror that lies beyond, that if you ever get to it, you're fucked. The thing with this Daemonettes is, if you ever get to it, you're fucked potentially in a very different way, or you're almost certainly corrupted, but you're not necessarily ended, which is a thing that makes their corruption much, much worse, because ultimately they can corrupt and continue their corruption in a way that would allow their cults, I think, to be far more successful. And I think that we constantly have to, as writers for Warhammer, rewrite the other Chaos powers to make them make sense as equal corruptors to Slaanesh, because Slaanesh is easy. All of the ways that it can corrupt with its focus on excess, going too far. We are, by our very nature, creatures of consumption. Now, all creatures are creatures of consumption. When we are given free rein in any environment, we tend to go too far without some sort of limiter put in place. And when you've got something breaking the limiters, people get fat. People take too much. People go too far. Our entire lifeblood on any of our news sites is about people doing too much of something and it turning out horrific. And at its heart, that is Slaanesh. And at the heart of Slaanesh is the Daemonette doing the corruption. So it's just a mundane answer in many respects, but most disturbing for me is the Daemonettes and how they have been massively underplayed in most writing, because to write them as true as they could be, the Warhammer world would be potentially screwed, because the very core nature of humanity is pretty much corruption by this entity. It's bad, not so great. So yeah, they Mr. Aleph there. How would you describe your take on Eldrazi? Aleph. So I have purposely been avoiding my takes on various elven gods, because I'm writing my take on various elven gods, and questions like this one I'll keep popping up, and possibly from you each time, asking about how I'd like to do one. And Eldrazi in particular, I'm actually having an argument with myself about how I best want to make Eldrazi work for the elven psyche. I've been working through each of the gods and building paths for my game in LAWhammer, where each of the elven gods and their influence upon the elven psyche is examined in some significant detail. And Eldrazi is one of the ones that I've been humming and hawing on, because I don't think I have nailed a good version of what Eldrazi should be in comparison to Khaine, and how Khaine presents, and also in comparison to some of the elven gods. And I want it to have a unique angle, something that very much feels that it's unique to that. So Aleph, I am really sorry to say this, particularly because you're so generous with your super chat, but I want to hold on this one because I am still sitting on my current take. If I'd been commissioned to do this, I'd have done this ages ago, but I haven't been commissioned to do this, so I've just been doing it in my free time as and when I have time, so I've still not dedicated the time that I need to properly think it out. And I don't want to give an answer on this one because I haven't figured it out for myself. It's a rare thing where I don't have an opinion, but it's because I'm actually trying to form a new opinion that I don't have one. It'd be very easy to just discuss the god as it's discussed on, say, Wikipedia. And if you want to know more about Eldrazor, just go type it into Wikipedia. That'll give you a nice, clean, little, simple example of what Eldrazor, the god for the elves, is. But I think I'm going to probably go in a slightly deeper version, not different. I'm very keen not to do something that's different. I don't like contradicting the existing lore. I like adding depth, but I'm definitely going to take it in a slightly new direction, but I haven't decided what yet for my personal version. So sorry about that. I know that's a bit of a weak answer. Charismatic Cardboard. I love your name. I'm loving the charismatic cardboard that is that box. Look at his little hat. What a jolly fellow. If I recall correctly, Slayer begins from the point of view of a random Hogland soldier, which I found exciting. Would you have liked to have written more stories from the point of view of random human soldiers? And spoiler, would you have written that particular soldier in Slayer to live? I'm quite happy killing off characters that we start off with anyway. So broadly speaking, yes. But you tend to find with Warhammer, whenever they start with a common soldier, if they write it for any length of time, it turns into a god. Warhammer writers just have this gentle add +1 each time they do a new novel, and that could no better be expressed with Gotrek, and then by Gotrek and Felix, who started off as just, you know, a poet and a slayer. And actually, it turns out Gotrek is a god. I could not in any way pull a better example than that. Now, there's lots of examples inside Warhammer literature where they obviously don't do this. There's, in some cases, even a few books in a row where they don't do this. Take, for example, just pick one at random. Angelica Fleischer novels, for example. Angelica Fleischer, who's a bone picker, has some really nice little stories wrapped around her, and she sticks with the core of her character in the same way that, for example, Detlef Sierk, the great playwright, as he's used as a character through Kim Newman's novels, he's never really dialed up to 11 too much. But I do think that, to take slightly different language, the slice of life aspect of Warhammer is often forgotten because the core drive of many of the novels is the war and the hammer of ensuring that big armies meet at some time and have a big crack at each other. So even characters that don't necessarily have anything to do with war suddenly find themselves at the edge of a big war as various troops are moving around and kicking living crap out of each other, because they are ultimately novels supporting what was then a war game. Yeah, do I feel that they should have done more of this? No, I'm happy with what we got. They gave us a broad mixture of different novels from different perspectives. They, I feel, in many cases, didn't necessarily stick to the existing Warhammer lore when they did it, meaning that we often have novels that are deeply contradictory to the established Warhammer setting. So if I was to call out one thing I wish they'd done, it would have been to have an overall editor for Warhammer in Black Library who had read all the books and was in tune with what the studio was looking for the Warhammer world to be, to ensure that what was created matched the studio's version and all the other versions too, because there's nothing wrong with doing all of it at once, and it often requires little in the way of editing, very little in some cases. It can often be not more than just a word or two here or there to bring all of the stories that look like they're wildly out of canon into canon, in terms of at least being events and characters that make sense with the existing canon of books that comes from Games Workshop's core Warhammer Fantasy battle setting, or the roleplay setting, if you believe that is also where you want to draw your canon from. I hate using the word canon like that. It never really sits well with me, given what canon actually means, but whatever. Charismatic Cardboard, I just did this one. So, thanks very much, Charismatic Cardboard. We're moving on. The Laughing God. Thoughts on Zacharias the Everliving? Zacharias. Badly used in the end times. Great character. Wished I'd pushed more for that character when we were doing final edits although it did not too bad in the second edition book for the vampires. So second edition Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay book, the Vampire Counts book that they did for that. I did a secret editing pass in that book when I was doing the mapping for it, and I kind of wish that I'd done a couple of extra suggestions for Zacharias. But in broad things, it's a character I really like that I wish had been handled much better in the end time. So keeping it nice and simple, I'll probably stick with that. I'll Flux, and finally, you picked the Lorebeards, Chris. Nice. Did Manny do the illuminations? More importantly, what do you think he missed? Okay, so this book felt like it was a book that was very much take each one of the undead things, write a thing about it, justify it all, wrap it up with a nice bow, off you go, Marianne. Because I'm pretty sure it was Marianne von Stauffer who did that one. In fact, I've got my copy sitting in just the other room through there. Do I think he did the illuminations? Strictly speaking, the illuminations are obviously from multiple artists, so the answer is probably no. But if I were to build an in-game version of the Lorebeards, then yes, my Manfred von Karstein would have done the illuminations, and they would have had that sort of sketchy, hand-drawn, Michelangelo-esque type look as I was working my way through it. Tried to build it more like a grimoire, and I would also say that I would probably have built it more like a grimoire if I was building it as a real world artifact. I'd probably change quite a lot of the language in it as well if we're building it as a real world artifact for your Warhammer world, but I broadly think that it's a really good start if you're building one for your own game. What do I think he missed? Freaking tons. It's a book that is focused upon the vampire counts, the undead of the old world, and the Tomb Kings in the south, which doesn't reflect what Manfred himself has investigated, because he has been across Cathay, the Pawn, into the New World, and he missed what lies beyond. And if I was to really pick out the core thing he missed, was I want to know about the undead in the Pawn, and it's not covered. I want to know how it expresses an Ind, in Araby in particular, so close to the realm of the dead. How does necromancy manifest in those neighbouring places? And none of that's really detailed. It focuses on what already existed in Warhammer at the time, and rightly so. Totally understandable. But if we were looking at it from what would make a better Manfred book, what he discovered in the Dragon Isles when he was passing through that area, what he discovered when he was making his way through Cathay, what has he seen that no one else has seen? And in many respects, that's what's missing. All we get is what everyone else has seen. We're not seeing what he would almost certainly have witnessed. And for me, that's the big missing thing. So hopefully that helps a bit. Moving down. Holy crap, we're almost at the end of the stream. I can't believe we're almost at the end of the stream. Hope you're okay out there, Sotek. Are humans the most prone to becoming ghouls? Obviously, other species eat brains all the time. Orcs, ogres, dark elves. Can ghouls naturally reproduce? Fine question. We'll be picking this one up next week in our ghoul stream with Sotek and I, assuming that we both turn up. Next Sunday, when we discuss ghouls at length, which is a perfect way for me to plug that, Jack. Thank you very much. But broadly speaking, ghouls as it stands are humans. Yes, they are. 100%. And that in and of itself is super fascinating as to why. And that's something we're going to be picking up during the course of the stream, because other species do indeed eat brains all the time, and that is worth discussing. And can they naturally produce? Yes. We sort of discussed that near the beginning of the stream, where we said what would happen if a human procreated with a ghoul and the potential outcomes of that. But we'll be dialing into that much harder when we do the actual stream on it. I'm personally really looking forward to this one, because ghouls is fascinating for questions like this, because we have a host of questions that we actually have answers to, which ghouls even existing leads us to go, well, what does this mean? And that, I think, is going to be a core component of what we're going to be discussing next Sunday when we do our ghoul stream, because there's definitely some interesting conversation that could be had there. Jorgen A. I have no idea if I'm pronouncing Jorgen correct, because it looks like an O to me, because I'm an English speaker. And I don't. Is it Jorgen? Is it Jorgen? I'm guessing it's Jorgen, and if it's not, apologies for pronouncing your name incorrectly. On the aforementioned matter of tribal human civilizations, what do you make of the idea of human cultures cohabiting with local beastmen? Perhaps not even as horrible as might imagine. So, there is multiple answers to this one, Jorgen, and it's a great question. It's one that got picked up inside the LAWhammer Discord at one point. If you're a member of our Discord, there's an entire conversation about building a beastman society that works with human societies that's kicking in one of our many Discord channels. If you aren't a member, do pop into our Discord chat. You're on YouTube. The link through to our Discord is in the comments just down below. Go click in there, dump in, and if you can't find the thread, just pop off into one of the general threads and say, help, where is this thing? And someone will point you to it, because we had it as a lore chat, and it was one of the earlier ones when we opened up the Discord channel, and it sort of kept on ticking along, because Lindsay, one of her core characters, way back in the past in a different version of Warhammer and Fantasy Roleplay, very much believed that beastmen could be brought on side, and believed that the worship of Tal was the natural place for beastmen to become. But it's worth noting a couple of things before we say that. Number one, Games Workshop's general discussion concerning beastmen is that they are the children of chaos. They poorly express what this means. They poorly express how they deal with their deities even. And entire paragraphs often just dance around exactly what they are. But it seems fairly certain that if you run with Games Workshop's existing background, that they are born of chaos. But as we know, many things that are born of chaos do not necessarily end up being of chaos. There is multiple things in the Warhammer world that started off being mutants or monsters that were created by the foul influence of chaos that have fallen underneath the sway of various quite non-chaotic factions. And there is also the truth that beastmen are living, breathing, thinking creatures that have their own thoughts, their own fears, their own loves, their own wants, their own needs, and that many of them will not, in their societies, fall into the same societal position that the beastmen as a whole have. I think there would be beastmen communities of all kinds. Many of them are brutal war herds that very much follow the diktats of the chaos gods or their shamans or whatever else. But I think there would be other beastmen communities also, because the Warhammer world is big and it is complicated and shades of grey dominate. So I think that there is very likely multiple examples of where human cultures may coexist, co-inhabit, or even indeed enslave, as the Dark Elves have done with beastmen, beastmen of various types. I think that they are two competing species that express differently in different places. And in the Empire in particular, they're known for the humans being civilization, the cities, and for the beastmen being the creatures of the wild, what do live there and move in herds and kill folk. Remember also that many of the beastmen, as this is often brought up in many sources, actually come from humanity, in that they were born human and left in the forest for others to pick up. So that some of our beastmen warlords were once part of human communities, and it's very possible something relatively similar could easily happen in an opposite direction. And again, LAWhammer, our roleplay stream, picks up that a little bit, Jurgen, where we have had a character who looks entirely human, but was, for example, born to beastmen. And that is an interesting outcome. Sarmelian Bloodweaver. Hiya, Sarmelian. We're going to potentially have to pick up. How many do I have left? Not that many left. I shall pick up speed to make sure that we get to the end here, and everybody gets good answers. Is there any lore about why Tzeentch, as a god of change, doesn't gradually change to be a god of something else, or turn good, or something weirder? I think the easiest way to say this would be that Tzeentch is often depicted as a multi-headed deity with conflicting goals going at any one time, and that each of these conflicting goals are often represented by a greater demon of Tzeentch. Now, this is just one way of many to describe Tzeentch and how it works, but it is often seen as a god that, unlike many of the other gods, has no central intellect. It's not a god that, as it sits there before you, is one entity. It is an entity of change, speaking with 1,000 voices, most of which contradict. So the existing lore is, it has already done all of those things. There is no turn good because it's 1,000 gods working in 1,000 different directions, and its one turn good voice is absolutely drowned out by his 999,000 other gods' voices going in those directions. There are some people in the background who have attempted to say that all of the Warhammer gods that aren't Chaos gods are just Tzeentch. Expressing in multiple different ways. So be aware there have been attempts to justify this by some writers in one fashion or another. Indeed, whenever I do my writing, I try to support all potentials. And say, for example, inside the Tome of Salvation in chapter 1, there's a nice little tiny little snippet right at the end of the first chapter, which is a quotation which is scrawled on a Temple of Mor, which says that there are no gods except the gods of chaos. All is chaos and we're all doomed to die. And that all of the other gods are nothing more than tricks of Tzeentch to basically drag souls to it through another route. And that's one reading you could potentially have. But the big thing is, philosophically speaking, in the Warhammer world, there would be philosophers who would argue this, that the divinity of the other entities is nonsense and doesn't exist at all. And it is just Tzeentch manifesting in different ways. And that's an interesting angle you could certainly take. So is there any lore about it? Yes, because as the god of change, it manifests in multiple different ways, and that could include good in some, but most writers, as far as they're concerned, Tzeentch at its heart is chaos, and no matter how it expresses, it is naturally going to be corrupting. So no matter what trickery may go on, in the end the horror comes out and the change is enacted and nothing is consistent. So yeah, kind of everything there. Still loading. Thank you very much, still loading. Hi, Andy. Hi. Does ranking Total War spells sound like fun? There's a freaking ton of them, isn't there? Total War Warhammer spells, and I don't know enough about them to properly rank them. I could easily rank the ones from the old world of Warhammer, because that's an easy job. Super easy. That one's good, that one's bad, that one's indifferent, that one's great. Boom. And I imagine the same would probably be the case with Total War Warhammer. I mean, ask Sotek that one, and if he thinks it's a good idea, I'd be more than happy to run with it. Although I'd probably be sitting more on the lore side for each of the spells and where they came from, rather than necessarily how they work in the game. A game that I am still pretty pants at in the greatest scheme of things. Tyrant25, thank you very much for Super Chat. How does Skulltaker keep his job when people like Abarash and Grimgor are thousands of years old and still in possession of their skulls? You know, it's a good question. I think the answer for this one is probably deeper than I can give with a pithy little segment here. But I think that the answer is that Skulltaker's story is by its nature much bigger than we realize. It has to be, to justify its position, to justify what it's doing, to justify its existence, to justify its failures. And regardless of its countless successes, which leads us with all bunch of unnamed characters that we don't really know because they would have been important if they'd survived, and they didn't because Skulltaker took skulls. I think that we have a part of the story that should be told. And so the answer to this one is, I don't think Skulltaker is wrong and shouldn't have his job. I think Skulltaker's story needs to be expanded to explain what's going on, I think. Cryotier. Hey, Cryotier, thank you very much. In Shadow of the Horned Rat. Oh, that's gone back. Kerodin says that his family stayed behind after the War of the Beard to keep an eye on certain menhirs. Was this a thing? Were there scout families of the elves that stayed behind in the old world? Yes. And it's an easy one to answer here. The answer is yes. In fact, you could argue that the entirety of the Lorelorn is founded on that core concept. So that's the Lorelorn where the Eonir go. Sadly, when they did the write-up for that in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4, they did not really touch upon this. And now I created the Eonir for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4 to start this conversation, actually, because I wanted the Lorelorn to be a bridge into a couple of older families who thought it was important, some of them from Safri, keeping control of and monitoring over some of the important waystones that were out there, but that kind of got lost. So the Lorelorn became this new thing, taking a slightly different direction after I moved out of the production job, and Lorelorn became A bit less, actually. They feel like lesser elves without the great majesty of the high elves or the dark elves or the wood elves. The Aeonir feel like they're like weird stepchildren that mix between a lot of them and aren't really their own unique society, which is a bit unfair, but I feel could have been taken slightly bigger. But the answer to this is, broadly speaking, yeah, definite. Krem Galto, no Sotek 2 weeks in a row. Guess I'm L new host. Yeah, you're the new co-host. Okay, Krem Galto. What would you say if you were the host? You have approximately a minute or so to say what your first thing would be if you were host. Get that into the comments fast before we stop. That guy, I think. Thank you very much for the super chat. Appreciated. First time catching a live stream. Excellent. You helped me write critically. Thank you. Oh, I'm delighted to hear that. Thank you very much. Slaanesh is a god of life to excess. So much so that they don't want the elves to disappear, hence they keep them. No, because excess does not have any concern at all for resource. It just goes. It consumes. Slaanesh is excess. Slaanesh is not moderation and understanding that this resource could come to an end. Slaanesh is excess. So I would suggest here that the concept of excess has not been taken far enough. You are thinking far too rationally. You're thinking like a proper thinking person, not thinking about something that is taken to absolute excess. It's chaotic, it's broken, it is wrong. I would suggest in this case, they just want to consume all the elves because they're tasty. Why are we trying to... But they're not doing the clever vampire thing of breeding them and trying to create a crop that they can use because that's what they like. They are living in the moment. They are like cats. Cats don't think about what's going to happen in the next week. They just eat whatever's in front of them. And Slaanesh is doing the same thing. They are just eating. So I would suggest that that's probably not the best reading, but I could get an argument that would make that possibly work. And even as I'm saying it, that guy, I think, I'm thinking of ways that I could make that work. But I think at its core, I'd be attempting to keep that excess. And excess does not know limitation. And they are just put a limitation in place. And I don't think that's probably for the best. Phil5991, how do you feel about plausibility when it comes to writing lore for Warhammer? Do you favour the rule of cool, or are you mindful to try and keep things somewhat grounded? Does it depend on the subject matter, with elves and dwarves being more out there rather than, say, salt to the earth Imperials? Rule of cool wins every single time, but plausibility also, for me, wins every single time. I see no reason that the two of them can't sit hand in hand. It's Warhammer. Warhammer has all of the tools at hand to allow everything to work within an established paradigm. It has internal consistent rules, including this is how we can be inconsistent. There is no reason that almost anything can't be built within the paradigm of Warhammer. My biggest problem is when they just contradict what exists and they don't say why. And that bugs me. So they say, for example, King X is in place when it was King Y in the last 30 books. Or they say this town is here when it was a different town in the other 20 books. That's my primary issues with the lore. But when it comes to the cool shit that they add, I like it when they don't worry about how it could exist. Because that means a roleplay writer can come along afterwards and add in all the detail. So I'm cool with people writing stuff that doesn't necessarily make sense. In fact, I'm not just cool with it, I love that shit. Because that's when I can come along and go, okay, well, if this is this and that is that and this is this, how can this exist? Well, that must mean this and that must mean that. And I love those thought puzzles, and it's often what lies at the heart of some of the better Lorebeard episodes. So I'm broadly cool with any route, but Warhammer at its heart is often dialed up to 11, even when it's at its most grounded. Just scrolling down, and one last there. Krem Gelto, we need more discussion of beards and less lore. Now, is that something to end on? More discussion of beards and less lore. Beard grooming techniques. What oils to use? To bother? Should we all curl up our moustaches at the side and turn into proper imperial gentlemen? That has just made me want to do that just for a Lorebeard stream, to curl my beard up, because that would be awesome. I think that is very fair. Krem Gelto, your subject of discussion, I think, is not a bad idea. I will pitch it to Sotek. I'm sure he will say that Lorebeard should be as much about beards as about lore. So next week, if everything goes according to plan, we should be on ghouls, and then bugmans will come after that, although we're getting dangerously close to Christmas. So we'll see exactly how that lands, but it will be ghouls next week, because both Sotek and I are very keen to do ghouls. Very, very keen to do ghouls. So that one will be happening, and because the Joseph Bugman ghoul stream vote was so close, we will be doing Joseph Bugman as well. We also have a host of streams that we'd like to do concerning potentially some of the new stuff that's coming into Total War, so be aware that we may do a couple on those things as well. So who can say exactly what order they'll all come in, but next week will almost certainly be ghouls, and when I finish this stream I'll be renaming this stream because it was not what it was intended to be. So that was great. Marvelous, in fact. Thank you very much, everyone, for turning up. I'm sad to see that Sotek did not make it, but it was my fault. Do not blame Sotek. Entirely my fault. We could even call it some sort of conspiracy. It wasn't. It was a mistake, but these things happen. I'm looking forward to seeing you all next week. I'm looking forward to hopefully streaming this Wednesday as well, assuming I am still well. I'm going on a bit of a roller coaster just now, but I presume that I will be. It will be amazing. Now, this stream I have kind of whizzed through. If I've missed anything, go ping me on Discord if there's anything I've missed. I will bring it up there. There is one thing I'm definitely going to do, though, and I'm going to try to remember, and that is to organize a stream about the Winds of Magic, because that needs to be done. So with that all done, thank you very much for turning up, and we will see you next time. Goodbye.